Hey Kaki, Neolakakoki. It's good to see you all. This time of year is always so good to see so many come from so far. And this year, a lot of times, we have multiple presentations on Family Day. This year we pared it down to just one. And no applause. It's like we finally got her to stop. So just one this year, but it's a very important one. And so for those of you who have been following the information we've been putting in the tribal newspaper and on the tribal websites about the initial nomination and subsequent approval of the Richardville home or house in Fort Wayne, Indiana is now considered is a National Historic Landmark. And that's a big deal, and that's a really important thing. And before I go any further, how many Richardville descendants do we have in the audience? Could you raise your hand if you're a Richardville? Okay. For those of us who grew up in Oklahoma, who are descendants of those who came this way, many of us, for a very long time, have had perhaps perceptions of the story surrounding Richardville, have read some history on our own, perhaps, have certainly heard at the feet of our parents and grandparents in the past that, and were led to believe or taught that Richardville perhaps was not the best of the best, was not, shall we say, a hero of those who went before us. And so there were some questions that were brought by tribal members, particularly, some of the older ones from here in Oklahoma, about the establishment of that place as a historic landmark. What's historic about that, was their question. We thought Richardville was the bad guy. We thought. And so as I started talking to George about that, and as the processes, and George Sr., as the processes that the tribe went through and participated in to assist in the landmark nomination and then the actual approval of that, we learned a lot. There's one thing we've come to know: we are still learning. Whether it's our language, culture, history, we continue to learn, and we learn new things. And we learn things that maybe correct those perceptions. We learn things that those who taught us to perceive that way didn't know. And had they known, they would not have taught us what they thought was fact. And so what we're going to do today, the only presentation we have, George Ironstrack, who's also a Richardville descendant, is going to give you a presentation about who is this Jean-Baptiste de Richardville. Who was that? Why is he important to us? And why is this house in Fort Wayne, Indiana, important? And in the course of this presentation, we're going to do about an hour before lunch. We'll break. Highly encourage you, and I believe that I won't need to encourage you to stay after lunch for the second part and conclusion of the presentation. I think we're all going to learn something today about this important leader of our people from many years ago and about our ancestor. And I think we're all going to leave today with a very changed perception and understanding. And it's important for us to change and understand because we're responsible to perpetuate stories, and we're responsible to perpetuate history to our children and our grandchildren as correctly as we possibly can. So if you would, please welcome your relative and mine, George Ironstrack.
Newe ewe malane. Apushe te pake neola kakoke oaha nungi kakikwe. It's also good to see you all here this morning. Nila Myaamia, Metosenia, Neme Shikya Wainswa Ane. Takamwa, Pinšiwa, Palanazwa Ewe Makeke. My name is George Ironstrack, and Pinšiwa, Jean-Baptiste Richardville, Palanazwa, and Pinšiwa's mother, Takamwa, are some of my relatives. And as Julie said, I'm going to talk to you today about one of the places where he lived and about the context of the history of this place. National Historic Landmark status is not something easily given or gained, is probably a better word in this country. The United States does not easily designate spots as historic landmarks. And so for them to do that with a site associated with the Myaamia people in any way is a sign of regard. We have to, of course, take that regard with a large grain of salt because it's the same country who removed us west, right? But it's still a sign of regard, a sign of respect. And before I launch into the presentation, I'll just add that in the application process, which is very lengthy and takes years, a good application that gets accepted takes at least 3 years, if not longer, to go through. And it's a team, a large team of people that write these applications. And Daryl Baldwin and myself, Nusa, my father, and Julie Olds all helped contribute to this effort, as well as did family members living in the Fort Wayne area. And the other sign of regard, I think, in this process is that in the past, these kinds of things would have been done without asking Miami people what they thought about things. They were just done. And this time, they asked us what we thought. And why that's important is they very much were focused on the building, the bricks and stones and the kinds of wood used and how it was representative of X architectural style and why it was important for those reasons. Or they were focused solely on Pinšiwa, on Jean-Baptiste Richardville, as the reason why it was important. But when they asked us, why is this house important, we came back with a whole host of reasons that were connected to the whole community, to the people that he represented, and constantly tried to push the conversation beyond bricks and mortar and beyond one person, which US historians love to focus on just one person, beyond that to the whole community. And in that way, our voice, Miami people's voices, show up in this application. And it was really powerful for me at the dedication in Fort Wayne when someone from the National Park Service came up as a part of the presentations, and he's wearing that green uniform with the, the Smokey the Bear hat. And he got up to give the presentation, and the words he spoke about the importance of the house were our words. Right? So that's important, that the National Park Service was talking about the importance of this house, quoting our words, which is a big change. That didn't happen 10 years ago. That didn't happen 20 years ago. So it's a big, significant shift. Now, it is a small shift. I don't want to say the status of this building changes everything, but it is a sign of regard, and it is a sign of shift in behavior. I want to start with an image of the house, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about people, and then I'm going to launch into the historical context of it. But I want to really start out by emphasizing through the Myaamia language, akima awiiki, the chief's house. Notice the name of the chief isn't there because the individual isn't as important as his leadership. And then I put up there kiikinaani, our house. And if you go back through our history, the lodges of the chiefs weren't really their lodges. They were usually their wife or their sister or their mother's lodge. Were the community space. They were the public space where important visitors were greeted, where important negotiations occurred, where the disbursement of very important goods occurred in the community. It was shared space. And Pinšiwa himself in the 1820s said that all of the property of the chief is at the mercy of his people at any time. They can take anything from him. And that the taking was both a sign of his humility and a test of his humility. And so he was saying that in the period of time in which this home was built. It was built in 1827. That quote comes from 1824, 1825. So I want to emphasize that, this space as collective space, not his. Myaamia people came into that space for the dedication, and we were joking afterwards. Members of the business committee were there, members of the community from the Fort Wayne area were there, as well as all these officials from the government. And it was a tiny little room, and everyone was packed into it. And we were joking that it was the highest density of Myaamia people per square footage in quite a while. Don't know if that's true or not, but we were all jammed in there like this, and it was kind of a funny moment. And they began this whole unveiling of the plaque for the National Historic status with our Myaamia children singing the greeting song in our language, which again is an important sign of change, growth of knowledge for us, and respect on the part of the people who hold the power when it comes to things like National Historic Landmark status. Another way to conceive of this house, rather than as a single-family home owned by a person, is as a chimwekane, as a council house. Now, I don't know for sure that it is a council house anymore, but I think it once was. I think this is where people gathered to discuss things of importance. And so it was probably called by this term when people went there to hold council. And our own business committee members held a kind of council there in the recent past. And as I watched them interact, for instance, with representatives from the state of Indiana and representatives from the US federal government, what I thought of as continuity, that people in this house, Myaamia people in this house, were interacting with the leaders of the territorial state of Indiana, eventually the state of Indiana, and representatives of the US government, Department of War, for a long time since its construction, and that continues in some ways today. And so last of all this, I come to the person, where a lot of the controversy that Julie mentioned centers on. And that's intentional. I'm coming to the person as last because it's the community that's important. And I'll share with you some of his own thoughts on this, but Richardville, throughout his tenure, constantly said he represented the voice of his people. He was not speaking for himself. And these are the only two known paintings of him that are attributed correctly. There's a third painting that maybe is of him, but we don't know for sure. And what I love in this is the contrast. So you have one from the 1820s, painted by Lewis here on the right, that he has a darker skin tone. He looks more quote-unquote Indian. He's wearing a peace medal, a sign of the treaty-making process. And then the other from later in life, where if you didn't know that this was Jean-Baptiste Richardville, you wouldn't think this was a Miami chief. And one of our young people was at this press conference for the unveiling, and she asked, well, was Richardville, white-looking or Indian-looking? And it's a great question that I can't answer because both of these are somewhat the imagining of the artist. Keep in mind, paintings aren't photographs, and even photographs are framed. And so instead, I look at these and I think, this shows some of the differing perceptions of him, the confusion of him. People couldn't make sense of Richardville in his time. And if you go back and read the documents, what you see are completely contradictory quotes about him. So here's two. And if you want more, I can provide you a 20-page document of conflicting quotes of Richardville. Here's one that I think lines up with the story that Julie told. This is from Benjamin Park at the Treaty of the St. Marys in 1818. This is where Richardville actually gains patent to the land where that house is built. And Benjamin Park, representing the US government, said, Richardville is avaricious, shrewd, acquainted with the value of property, and his manners that of a well-bred gentleman. Right? He's behaving in a manner that is polite. Right? He understands the value of the land for which he's negotiating. He must be shrewd, he must be greedy. Right? From Wallace Bryce, a community historian in Fort Wayne, contrasting quote, Richardville's kind and charitable hand was never withheld from the distress of his own people or from the stranger. This is the behavior of a Myaamia leader who cannot withhold anything from his people and is expected to treat guests with a kind and welcoming manner. These two quotes cannot exist in the same space. Someone cannot be both completely greedy and shrewd and yet be kind and charitable. Those things don't work together. So the question is, why? Why do these conflicts constantly show up? Throughout the course of this presentation today, I'm not going to answer that question because I don't know the answer to it fully. I'm going to explore some possibilities and look at how historical confusion is created and then how that affects our understanding of our history today as a people. So who was this man? Was he the greedy, selfish, materially focused individual, or was he selfless and representing his people? Why did he confuse people in his period of time? And why does he continue to confuse people today? If you go and read stuff published just from 3 years ago about him, they say, again, completely contradictory things about him, and I think fail to do him justice. So how are these historical confusions created? We're going to look at how confusion seeps into the historical record by looking at stuff that has little or nothing to do with Richardville. Let's take one example. This is one a historical confusion that I grew up with. Maybe some of you did as well. I didn't know where the word Miami came from as a young person, and I heard lots of different conflicting origins for the word Miami. One of the most common ones that showed up is this word, Umamik, and it was constantly translated as the people of the peninsula. And if you look at Bert Anson's book, he cites this, and he quotes a Jesuit from the 1750s, Gabriel Druillettes, as saying this. Other explanations I heard is that it means my friend in French, or pigeon was the other one that I heard a lot of. Well, none of these are correct. They're categorically incorrect. Through our own work, through the work of David Costa, our tribal linguist, and Darrell Baldwin, we've come to understand the origin of the word Miami, the word we use to refer to ourselves. And it comes from a term that shows up in lots of different related languages. So all the people who lived around us had a very similar word. And it's Myaamia. And it means the downstream person. It's actually singular, and then we kind of use it to mean the plural as well. Plural would actually be Myaamiake, but we sometimes use Myaamia plurally. And you can show this in the linguistic record. You can show that this term once existed in our own language, likely, and then once it became our personal name, we shifted to a different word to mean downstream so that we wouldn't confuse it in our own language. You could see perhaps a connection here, like peninsula, water, but a peninsula is not a stream. It's not a reference to stream and sort of a downstream. It's a reference to a body of land sticking out into water or water surrounding land. Why does this matter, this tiny little thing, right? This tiny little confusion that I grew up with? Well, names have power in a very real sense. This is someone else telling us what our own name means. This is us working very hard to discover for ourselves what our own name means. This name, downstream, connects to bodies of water, rivers. Our landscape, our historic landscape, and our current landscape is centered on rivers. Here, the Nujongisipiwe, the Neosho River. In Kansas, the Lazine River. In Indiana, the Wapashikisipiwe, the Wabash River. So our lives were river-focused. All of our stories are centered there. All of our historic villages were centered there. So downstream is a powerful idea, right, that is embodied in our name. So it's very, very important. What's interesting when you go back and look at this is that Gabriel Druillettes never actually visited the Miami village he supposedly got this name for. So he writes this down, it shows up as the first record, and everyone copies it and ends up in all the history books. So it's like a weed. It begins with one person making a mistake. This probably was the Potawatomis saying a word like this, and for some reason, instead of writing something about water and downstream, he wrote this about peninsula. Don't know how he came to that misunderstanding. It's just a simple mistake. But like a weed, it grows throughout the historical record. And if you go online today and you search Miami Tribe of Oklahoma, you will find web pages that use this name and use this quote to this day. It's only in our own materials that you'll find this explained more clearly. Here's another confusion that shows up in the historical record. Again, I heard this in my own family. It shows up in my own family's historical genealogies. Akwinakwe shows up as a really early Myaamia leader. And he gets called Little Turtle's father. He first shows up, this person that gets called Akwinakwe, shows up at the Treaty of Lancaster in 1748. The treaty occurred in Pennsylvania. He didn't actually write out his name. He spoke his name, and the translators there wrote it down on paper. If you go back, Pennsylvania actually engaged in an intensive effort to preserve its historical record that begins in the 1830s. If you go back to the very first typeset document, what you find is not Akwinakwe, but Chikwinakwa. At some point, more than likely based on the research that I'm seeing right now, in the 1880s, as all the counties in Indiana began to write their county histories, which were done not by professionally trained historians usually, but by amateur historians, and they usually just copied each other's records. So it was more like mimeographed history. In 1887, you see in the history of Miami County, someone make this mistake. Aguanakwe. And somehow they saw this as a capital A. And so they changed it to Aguanakwe. And this begins to spread like a weed through the other county histories. Again, as we learn more about our own language, we begin to unravel these things. We can untie these knots. And it turns out that Chikanakwa is a very common mishearing of the Myaamia word Mishkanakwa. Oftentimes, English speakers don't hear the mi out front, and what they hear is Shkanakwa. They then wrote down Shikanakwa. This person's name was Mishikanakwa, which is the exact same name carried by the person called Little Turtle, who lived from 1747 until 1812. And this is the name of the painted terrapin. It's actually a pretty common, fairly common Myaamia given name. It shows up throughout time. Why does this matter? Well, again, names have power. They're saying this Myaami person negotiating a treaty in 1747 that his name was this. This doesn't mean anything in our language. People have said, well, this means turtle, and Misha means little. Well, that's an incredible mistake because Misha actually means big, and this does not mean turtle by itself. There is no word for turtle in our language. There's species-specific names. So names have power. Second reason why it's important is it's not clear this man was Little Turtle's father even. If you go back and look at the primary source references, there are no references to the Mishikanakwa in 1748 who's an adult being the father of this Mishikanakwa who was born in either 1747 or 1752. There is no reference to it. Mishikanakwa, the person we call Little Turtle, said in a speech that his fathers lit the first fire at Detroit and Pickawillany. And since this man was at those places, people have said, well, their names are the same, so they must be father and son. Except that's not how Myaami naming traditions work. That's the way Anglo-Saxon naming traditions work, right? Very rarely in a historical record do you find a son carrying the exact same name as his father. The rare places it shows up is after the father has died some years later, the son takes his name. That doesn't really start to happen, though, until after removal. And that's because they've begun to understand European expectations about naming, and that if they carry their father's name, they get to carry their father's legacy. But that's a manipulation. They're doing that on purpose. Previous to this, in this time period, it was very, very rare. Why does this matter? Well, these are historians telling us who we descend from. Sometimes descent is lost. Sometimes we can't know who Mishikanakwa's father was. And maybe that's okay, accepting what we can't know, versus accepting a story told by outsiders that this man must be Mishikanakwa's father. This story has spread like a weed throughout Myaami genealogies. It shows up in a lot of our family genealogies. And what I want to point out here is it's not wrong fully, but it is a mistake that we have to correct and unlearn. And that by focusing on our language and culture and what we're learning about it, we can untangle a lot of these knots. So how do we do this? How do we untangle these knots? Because there are bigger knots we're going to get to today, a lot more difficult and more challenging historical confusions. We could hire the history detectives. And they do a great job and they make it really entertaining. We could become our own detectives. By that I don't mean I become your detective and I work for you. What I mean is we all become our own detectives. We all work to look at questions that we thought we knew the answers to and just go back and look at them again with a fresh set of eyes and say, well, maybe I'll just take a different look at this. Maybe in the end, you go through it all and you decide, nope, my initial conclusion was okay. Or maybe you'll come to a whole new set of questions. And that's where history really gets fun, is when you come to a whole new set of questions. Rarely do you ever get to answers, sorry to say, but the questions can be really fun. And for me anyway, I like to use our growing understanding of our language and culture to ask these new questions. Right? That's a part of how you can get at things like, was Mishikanakwa, the signer of the Lancaster Treaty, the father of the Mishikanakwa, who became very famous as Little Turtle? Right? That's how you can get at those questions, is by looking through language and culture. And to challenge ourselves to look beyond the usual story. The first story you hear is usually the most general story that gets across basically the basics of what happened. That usual story isn't often completely wrong, but to tell that story, you have to gloss over counterexamples usually, you have to gloss over the nuance, and most importantly, you have to gloss over the nitty-gritty stuff of life, which is where life is not easy. Personalities are not simple. This room full of people here and all the differing ideas of where the nation should go and what the nation could do. Imagine trying to write a history of this moment, right? It's very complicated. Historians have to create generalizations out of the messiness of life. In doing that, they have to erase certain things, which is why you have to always look at the usual story and say, what's missing here? You don't have to say it's wrong. It's rarely ever wrong these days. The older histories can be really wrong. But the histories written recently aren't really wrong. They're just missing details sometimes. They're missing perspective. And I would say it's almost always limited. So one of the usual stories that we have to go back and look at very differently that will help us understand, I hope, the akima awiiki, the chief's house, differently, are treaties. This is a painting. It's the only known painting of the Treaty of Greenville in 1795. This is a zoom in of it. And people oftentimes call this painting the whole one. This is the Treaty of Greenville. It's actually not, though. It's painted by one of Wayne's aides, and Anthony Wayne's aides, and it's actually just depicting the day after the last day of negotiation, where Little Turtle has a private conversation with Wayne. So this is not a treaty negotiation. This is two dudes having a conversation. Now, they happen to be pretty important people, but this is not a treaty negotiation. Why is that important? Because the Treaty of Greenville, if we had a painting of that moment with hundreds of indigenous people sitting and the one person standing with their belts to talk and everyone looking at them, that'd be an impressive painting to see. It was an impressive moment. When you go back and you read that treaty transcript, it is impressive. I'd love to have a painting of it. This is not it. But this idea of two heads of state, Little Turtle being the head of state of the Myamis and Wayne representing the head of state of the US, is a powerful idea of how treaties work, that they're nations negotiating things through their elected heads of state. And these things are formalized documents that resolve problems between the two groups. That is a very Euro-American perception of treaties. That's not what Mishikanakwa and other Miami leaders at this treaty thought they were doing. I'll talk about what they thought they were doing in a minute. Second thing is we have to look at battles from a different perspective. The older histories focused almost exclusively on treaties and battles. Battles were the moments where people decided that violence was the best means to carry out either the defense or, in terms of aggression, the will of their people, the desire of their people. But battles, for us, were very infrequent and didn't necessarily define us as a people. But oftentimes, US history focuses on violence associated with American Indians, rather than all the other aspects of diplomacy. In 1818 and 1826, when the treaties are signed that lead to that house being built, violence is no longer an option for us. Battles are not a choice. We cannot fight the US government anymore. And the lack of that tool actually heavily affects what we can do in the realm of negotiation. So it's important that we understand the limiting nature by focusing on violence. For those of you who are at last year's presentation, I'm going to situate the history of the akima awiiki of the Chief Richardville House within an outline of Myaamia history and talk about his own life in the context of that broader history. That through the house and through this person, we can learn one perspective, one slice of our history. That he becomes a lens and the house becomes a lens to look back. So I'm going to talk about the years before Pinšiwa is born, the pre-contact years and the early years of contact. He was born near the ending of the early years of contact in 1761. And then I'm going to talk about the era that most defined his life, the Myaamia Wars, the wars with the Americans, and the treaty period, which are really one and the same. And this is why I say we have to take a different look at violence. The goals of the Americans and the goals of our leaders were the same when they were fighting and when they were at the treaty table. This is the same period for us. And so violence is just, and violence in the treaty table become different tools to establish the same goals. And then we'll look briefly at the removal period. This is after he has died, to look at what happens when massive failure occurs inside a community. And we won't get much to talking about national revitalization today, but I'll come to it in the ending, because a part of the consequences of this history is that we are here today in this room, of course. So let's start by looking just briefly at the pre-contact era. This is our historic landscapes. A place we call Myaamia, bounded by the Mississippi in the west, the Ohio River in the south, the Scioto in the east, the St. Joe's of Michigan into what is today the state of Michigan, and then up into what is today Wisconsin. And our first story, the oldest story we have of ourselves as a people, is of our emergence, somewhere on the Sakiwe Sipiwe, either where its mouth meets Lake Michigan, or downstream, or upstream rather, where South Bend, Indiana is today. And the story tells us this is where we emerged as a distinct and different people. This is a nice pictorial representation of that from a Myaamia artist, Katrina Mitten. It's a beaded vest showing two people swimming to the surface to grab the branches and pull themselves out of the water, which is what the story describes taking place. It's a story of struggle. Emergence under our historical homelands wasn't easy, and what we were leaving behind must have been pretty challenging. We don't know what that was, but people likely don't pick up and move for easy reasons. So something difficult had occurred, and they struggled to come out and emerge in this new place. They then built a village at what is today Elkhart, Indiana, and from there down to what people call Myaamia Minutene, the Miami towns, or Kiikinaani, what is today Fort Wayne, at the confluence of the Cochisa Sipiwe and the Namewa Sipiwe, where it forms the Tawawa Sipiwe, the Maumee, which goes into Lake Erie. And there's a portage there that links into the Wabash. And from there, our ancestors descended the entire northern Wabash and built villages along the Wapashika Sipiwe and all of its feeder streams. Here's some of the sites of our major villages. Myaamia Minutene, the Miami town, being the largest over the course of our history. Most of our villages being centered inside this oval here, our heartlands, with a few, like the Piankashaw village here near Vincennes, and the Myaamia village near Pickawillany being outside that. And of course, we have to remind ourselves this is not a nation state. This is a shared landscape. You can see all the tribal peoples that shared this landscape are with us. They all had their own heartlands, their own centers, and then the space out here, we all overlapped. We figured out how to share that space for hunting and gathering. For the most part, the relationships with these groups is one of peace. We called most of them elder brothers. Groups like the Peoria we called younger siblings, and groups like the Delaware we called our grandfathers. I think you'll notice that quite a few of these groups are now around us here in Oklahoma, some of them in this very county. So our history with them goes back a long ways. Inside the village space, these would have been the dwellings that you would have found there. Longhouse, bark-covered houses, cattail mat-covered houses, these are the uncovered frames. And the village space was controlled by the women. This is going to be an important thing to keep in mind. If I don't mention it enough today, call me on it at the end. When you look at the treaty record, let's say beginning in 1818, all the way through the removal treaties, you will find few to no references of Miami women. Right? No references to what was well over half the population in that time period because the rate of death among males was so high. So you could say, let's say 55% of the population doesn't show up in the record. It's an important absence. Why? Because the influence of women leaders and the female council was very, very strong. So for every conversation that was occurring between male leaders from our community and representatives of the US government, there was a parallel conversation that preceded it with the Women's Council. That goes untalked about in the historical record, so it's not documented. And in the cases where we haven't preserved oral tradition of those stories, it becomes forgotten. But every treaty You look at all those dates. Imagine a conversation occurring with the Women's Council before that treaty took place. They then have to communicate that to the Men's Council. They likely have disagreement and have to work it out back and forth before they can ever show up at the negotiating table with the Americans to create an agreement. The women in the period of time previous to the Treaty of Greenville decided when wars began, and they decided when wars ended. Wars were usually about captives, about adopting new people into the community, and it was the women who made those decisions. And you can see in this quote that when they've decided a war should end and a prisoner shouldn't be executed, they could go in and stop it. Right? So there was a lot of influence that women held. They were responsible for different things, but those responsibilities balanced out, and their influence was equal to men. Right? So power wasn't equal, it was equitable. But each had its own areas of influence. Women were responsible for raising the families. They controlled the lodges. They controlled the central village space and the farm fields. Men were responsible for hunting, for war, and for external negotiation and trade with outsiders. So outside the village space was male space. This diagram kind of highlights that. Inside the village space is a realm of peace. Outside the village space is a realm of uncertainty, danger, and sometimes violence, the realm of war, mishikatwe. In this realm, you could have people who were strangers, behikechike, or you could have people who are our enemies, kitakiamonanake. This was space where hunting occurred, and sometimes violence is what occurred on the hunting grounds between men as well. Inside the village space, and here we come back to the importance of understanding treaties differently. Inside the village space is where Awenda One was created, where peace was created, alliance. And Awenda One, when you look at our language, builds off of a stem, ewem, that can also be used to create a word that you probably heard some of us use today, ewe makeke, my family, my relatives. And that same stem can be used to communicate that you are thankful, ewenga ane. So for us, peace and alliance are associated with issues of family and being thankful and grateful to each other, issues of reciprocity and exchange, that we're responsible to each other through that process. This is glaringly different from the Americans' perception of what a treaty is. A treaty is a calculating document between two nations to solve a particular issue that oftentimes involves an exchange of something, but that exchange isn't designed to create reciprocity. It's just supposed to end the war. So a lot of times if you look at the ending of World War I, that treaty is not equitable. The Germans get saddled with a huge debt and everybody else gets what they want. So the treaty is not about creating equitable exchange. It's about solving that issue. That's true for treaties stretching all the way back to our ancestors' relationships with them. Inside the village, there were numerous different leaders. I'm going to focus just today on leaders that served the whole community. The first is the civil chief. And sometimes we actually say civil leader rather than chief, because chief oftentimes implies something that's modern today, and we don't want to necessarily mix those. The civil leader in this period was the person responsible for representing the will of the village, akima. That position had a parallel female role, akimakia, the female civil leader for the village, and they then represented councils, a male council and a female council. Sometimes these two people were related, sometimes not. There was a lot of training and preparation that went into becoming these two positions. It oftentimes looks like the positions are inherited, like passed on from father to son. And that could have been the case, but it also just could be the case that within families are where you have knowledge concentrated. And so if those are the most knowledgeable people about this particular job, then it seems highly likely that someone else in that family is going to learn those same skills. Rather than just inheriting it, they still have to show the aptitude and the desire. And we can see in our history places where leaders behave poorly and they're replaced. Kapia was another important role, the chief's assistant. This person was responsible for dividing goods. So when rare goods were brought into the village to be distributed or traded, the kapia is the one who actually divided things. In this way, the akima was removed from accusations of favoritism. A newer position evolved as negotiations got larger. So as villages, Myaamia villages originally could do their own thing. they would oftentimes work together with each other to defend themselves or to make new agreements with outsiders. But if a village wanted to do something different from the other villages, no one could stop them, no one could force them. So the village was very much independent. After the Treaty of Greenville, and in some cases to a certain extent before that, that's not the case because Europeans expect when one Myaamia village agrees to something that all Miamis agree to it. And if one Myaamia village, for instance, decides to go a violent route, well then all Myaamia villages are deemed enemies. And so there's a new need to create a means of getting all of the various akima, all the chiefs, to agree to things together. And to have one person who could communicate that in a treaty negotiation. So you have a whole new layer of complexity. It's already difficult enough to get a room full of people to agree to something. Imagine a village, and then imagine getting 6 villages to agree to something. When you have to figure out how to do that in the span of a couple of years to make those adaptations. You never did it before, and now all of a sudden the Americans are demanding it of you. Well, Mawe Akima, the principal council chief, evolves to meet that need. The other kind of leader that exists in the other realm is Nenaoetua, the village war leader, leading small war parties, usually to take captives, either for adoption or for ritual torture. And then in this new period of time, a new position evolves, Mamekake Akima, war chief, who again leads much bigger war parties, linking multiple war parties from multiple villages together. So kind of like a parallel to this leader, you have one in war as well. This position disappears for all real purposes after the War of 1812, after violence ceases to be an option. In the early years of contact, we have quite a bit of disruption. So as Europeans first meet us, they're meeting a disrupted people. The Iroquois push into our homelands, seeking massive amount of captives to adopt into their villages, and our people flee to the north. I talked more in depth about this story last year. If you have questions about it, I can talk to you about it afterwards. It's up north in Wisconsin, what becomes Wisconsin, where we first meet the French. It's there that the first records, like Drieet's records, show up, the people of the peninsula. He's describing us in exile in the north. Right? That's where that name gets attached to us. Over the course of the next 20 years, we built a series of alliances with other people who had to flee this area and the French. And we pushed back on the Iroquois, on the Haudenosaunee, and moved back into our homelands. By 1700s, we're living back in our homelands again. It's in that context of return that Pinšiwa, that this man also called Jean-Baptiste Richardville, is born. He's born in 1761, in the midst of the longest period of stability in our documented history, which lasted from 1700 until 1780. 80 years of stability is all we've had as a people in the last 400 years. And he was born in the midst of that. The stories say, and I say this is a story that is somewhat mythological. I'm not sure how true it is, but it exists everywhere. He was born in a birthing house nearby the old apple tree in the Fort Wayne area, Mishimijakwa. And what's interesting about that is that this kind of tree wasn't native to North America, so it was planted there. But it was given a Myaamia name, and it was used by Myaamia people. And so it shows the adaptation of Myaamia people to new things, both plants, animals, and technology. And if it is true, it is a kind of fitting tree to be born under for a leader who had to help his people deal with all kinds of change. Most of his life was spent in this period of time, though. So he was born in 1761. By 1780, we're beginning our wars with the Americans. And I would argue in one form or another they last until removal, and in some cases continue even after removal. Our wars with the Americans in some ways continue to this day. They've changed form, but they continue. In this period of time, as a very young man, you can see here's the various invasions of our homelands. Most of them launching from Cincinnati. I perceive the space of Cincinnati very differently when I think of it this way. It was the launching point of 3 major invasions of our homelands. 1790, 1791, and 1794. Hamar, St. Clair, and Wayne. And there were also invasions from the south into our homelands. These were less successful and oftentimes get talked about less in the records. Hamar and St. Clair were defeated. Those defeats are oftentimes attributed to Michikanakwa, to Little Turtle. I think it's fair to say that the defeats, the credit for those belong to all of the people who were living in this area. He gets a lot of credit as an individual, in Hamar's attack on Fort Wayne, we have the lone case documented of Pinšiwa, of Jean-Baptiste Richardville, fighting against the Americans. And he fought against Hamar on the third day of fighting in Fort Wayne at the ambush along the Cochisa-Sipiwe, the St. Joseph's River. And he described that battle later in his life, that they had basically created a crossfire for American troops, and there were so many dead in the stream that you could walk across the river on the backs of the dead, which included Myaamia people as well. We defeated Hamar that day, but had to burn our own village before fleeing it. And one of the great downsides of this battle is that the lodge that held our belts and blankets that told our older histories was destroyed. And that's perhaps why we don't know stories previous to our emergence onto our landscape, as they were destroyed that day. So this was the chaos that he experienced as a young man. Our village is constantly attacked, constantly being burned, people constantly having to flee and then rebuild, replant. You couldn't plant your crop in the spring and count on it being harvestable, because by fall, the army might come and destroy it. They usually tried to time their attacks to destroy the harvest while it was ready to be harvested or right after you'd harvested it. So there's a lot of instability in this period of time. He was born to a Frenchman and a Myaamia woman. Takama was his mother. And she was probably a female leader. We don't have a lot of documentation to prove that, but the regard with which she was held seems to indicate that she was the akima, the female leader for her village. She was also a very successful fur trader, and she ran an operation carrying goods from what is today Fort Wayne down to the Forks of the Wabash, and charging a fee for that, for fur traders. His father, Antoine Joseph de Richardville, was a French trader, military man, diplomat, and he appears not to have been a very nice guy to his mother. And as was common in Myaamia cases, if the husband mistreated the wife, they divorced. And so she divorced him, and he eventually left. Pinšiwa did spend some of his youth visiting with his father up in Montreal. And so he arrived at adulthood being multilingual. He spoke Myaamia, he spoke French, he read and wrote Latin. He may have spoken Seneca, an Iroquoian language, and at some point he learned to speak English. So he was a multilingual person, which was the norm in his village. The reading and writing Latin was probably unique, and being able to read and write French probably made him unique. But the multilingual part, a lot of people spoke multiple languages. But the reading and writing coupled with the Latin and French and English later made him an incredible asset at the treaty table. A lot of the American history books focus on this man, Michikanakwa. This is a painting by Julie Olds. We have no good images of Michikanakwa from his lifetime. This is a beautiful imagining of what he might have looked like. Born much earlier than Pinšiwa, and he died right before the War of 1812 broke out. And he transferred from being a war leader to being a peace leader. The Americans tended to hold war leaders in high regard, and so after the victories against St. Clair and Hamar, Wayne wanted to meet with the other general. That's who he wanted to meet with, because they saw that person as the most important person. Now, Michikanakwa probably came from a family of civil leaders, and so he had learned a lot of those skills, and his oratory ability seems to indicate he had had a lot of training in how to do these things. But it seems as though previous to this, he wasn't the civil chief. And this was a part of a compromise that was made with the Americans, because they really wanted to negotiate with this guy who had beaten them twice. And so he did. And his oratory skills earned him increasing regard. But just as with Pinšiwa, he was representing the voice of his community. He was serving his community. We call it servant leadership. He wasn't a titular leader who could command and tell people what to do. To end those wars with the Americans, which had become very costly, to gain stability again, we negotiated a treaty. We created a Wayne-to-Own a peace with the Americans. And this peace came with numerous compromises. We tried to reaffirm our sense of family in this process, And it appears that Wayne somewhat understood this. He accepted the title of father for the Americans in this family. In return for the peace and stability, we had to give the Americans the right to this land. Now, this wasn't unusual. People say American Indians didn't know about land ownership. Well, they didn't understand the Euro-American legal sense of land ownership, but they used to negotiate the use of land all the time. Sharing with all these tribes, they constantly had to negotiate who was going to use what hunting ground, what year, who was going to build their village where, who was going to use what gathering ground. But they viewed always those negotiations as temporary. We give you the right to settle here. This is what we said to our grandfathers, the Delaware. We give you the right to settle here on the White River. But you recognize that these are our homelands and you're sharing them with us. And the Delaware did that. This was different, though. This was to be permanent. We were to give them influence and control over this space in perpetuity. And instead of just being sort of zones of influence, like we recognize your zone of influence is down in the southern Wabash, this is saying, this is a box, and you don't cross into it anymore. This is ours. The other thing that's left out a lot of times in discussion is all of these military reservations that were created. So the first reservations in our homelands were for the US military. Right? And you can see there's throughout our homelands, especially where all of our villages were, there's tons of these military reservations. Each of these then had a fort, a small amount of troops, and a trading post. What this means, it has huge consequences going forward if our people were to ever select violence to resist the Americans. Well, there's a bunch of forts now in the middle of our homelands, so reprisal from troops can come much quicker than ever before. Let's look at that from a cultural perspective. So here's our homelands with all the people that we shared it with. Here's for us the territory, which had one major village site in it and was heavily used as a hunting ground and as a trail crossing over into Kentucky where we hunted, where we made war on the Cherokee. This land was then lost, and you can see all the reserves scattered throughout the reservations for troops. Some of them at the heart of our heartlands. After the Treaty of Greenville, I think the idea was we'd give that land and then there'd be peace. And things changed very, very rapidly. And this is best highlighted by a series of trips taken to the East Coast, which again, this is not in the historical record very often. We were travelers. We traveled. Well, one historian I'm working with has found perhaps references to us being on the East Coast in the 1600s. We traveled widely. One of our students was doing research on obsidian. There's obsidian found throughout Ohio. That obsidian comes from Yellowstone. So goods moved throughout this country, always, even before European arrival. So people traveled all the time. But this was a new kind of trip. They went east to meet with the US government in Philadelphia and then later in DC, and they also went to Baltimore. And one of the most interesting trips, I think, for me is in 1807, and that's because Michikanakwa, this older generation of leader, traveled with Pinšiwa, who was the next generation of leaders. And they were accompanied by Ipikanita, a man also called William Wells. And they went to DC and Baltimore partially to meet with Quakers who were seeking to help the modernization campaign within the Myaamia tribe to build farms and to learn how to farm from an American perspective in an attempt to convince the Americans that we could be, quote unquote, civilized. But it's interesting to think what other lessons they learned about the Americans while they were out east. And this quote comes from Little Turtle from one of his first trips, but I think the lesson was reinforced each trip they made. The increase of the whites is inconceivable. More than the lives of 2 men have not elapsed since they first set foot in this country, and yet they already cover it like swarms of flies and gnats, while we, who have inhabited it for no one knows how long, time immemorial, are as thin as deer. Michikanakwa, 1798. He goes on to describe he understands perfectly well the American economic system. He understands how a yeoman's farm works and why that kind of farming can lead to more children than Miami family lifestyles, and then how, after 2 generations, that leads to huge population inequities. So he clearly has the understanding of how American economics functions and how the American population is growing. He understands what they're up against. So they go to Washington, D.C. This is a painting from 1800. And they get to see the nation's capital, fairly newly constructed capital at that, and see the massive enterprise that exists there. the populations and the buildings, the streets, not as a sign of look how civilized the Americans are, but just look how much population pressure there is and how much force they can bring to bear. They go to New York City. This is from a little bit earlier. This is from the 1790s. So the attire would have been different. But the city was built up. The population was immense. They go to Baltimore. This is from the 1830s, so it's a little bit later, so you can erase the smokestacks from this image. But Baltimore was one of the largest cities in that part of the country at this time. Its population was huge. And Little Turtle observed the international commerce going on there and was surprised by the diversity of faces. He was really surprised by just the people from the Caribbean he saw there, all these groups. He described the labor process. He knew how each individual who wanted to live there had to have a skill. And he first and foremost, when asked, what's strangest about this place? He said, I don't speak your language. It's the first thing he said. Which is, again, coming back to a Myaamia worldview. Language is how we define ourselves. He said, clothes, I could get used to wearing these clothes, or I could wear those clothes, no big deal. But language, that really strikes me as different. So they really began to realize in the early 1800s what they were up against. If they chose to fight the Americans anymore, this is what they were fighting. All of that. And this is reflected at the treaty table. And so when the Americans come and demand more and more land, they don't have necessarily another option but to negotiate. They also have begun to lose their economy. So Little Turtle describes he understands how the American economy works. How the Miami economy worked was, here's where we farmed corn, here's where we hunted bison, here's where we hunted bison and white-tailed deer and eastern elk and other animals. Here's where we gathered tubers. Here and here is where we had sugar camps. We needed this whole space shared with other tribes to sustain ourselves. That's how our economy worked. As a treaty process and as settlers and squatters ate away at that, we lost our ability to feed ourselves. And so treaties became the new means by which we fed ourselves. The money gained from the treaties, the goods gained from the treaties is how we sustained ourselves, while our leaders tried to figure out and our people tried to figure out, what are we going to transition to? Because this old way of life is not going to exist anymore. They can see it. And we can't push them out. We can't violently resist them anymore. So what are we going to do? I'll conclude and take questions we can break for lunch on the eve of the War of 1812. And so I've taken us just a short amount of space in terms of years, but I'm really trying to set up the context within which this house was built and the later negotiations occurred. In 1808, Tenskwatawa, the Shawnee prophet, and his brother Tecumseh moved their village from the site of the first Treaty of Greenville directly into our heartlands where this sun is. They were not invited. This was space that other tribes didn't come into and build their villages unless, like the Delaware, they were invited. And they came here and they built Prophetstown, and they began to agitate for violence against the Americans. And in fact, small-scale violence begins to occur even in that period. This is not something we wanted, and it's something that our leaders realized was incredibly foolhardy from our perspective, because you cannot win militarily. This group, of course, doesn't believe that. They believe they can win. And the violence that occurs here, first in November of 1811, and then throughout 1812 and 1813, basically sets our whole world on fire. And so despite our best attempts to build a relationship with the Americans that allowed us a path towards survival, the violence of other groups inflames the whole countryside. And all of our villages and towns, every single one of them is burned again. By 1812, a sizable portion of our population joins the British to fight against the Americans, but it's only after they burn all of our villages because we chose a neutral path. That then sets up the Treaty of 1818, which is where we'll start after lunch. So this complete failure to produce peace and this struggle to find a new economy, the full realization of how big the American nation state is, and then the violence of the War of 1812 basically destroying all of our attempts at peace, is what sets up the treaty years from 1818 until 1846. Questions? I don't know how much time we have until lunch. Yeah, Reed?
When you described the various villages that were some distance one from the other, how did they form around family or clan groups, or how were those distinct locations formed in terms of inhabitants?
So these villages, they all, according to the stories in Trowbridge, started as families. So that the way Trowbridge's story says is that the first major village settled that is in sort of continual settlement is Kiikinaani, the Myaamia towns. And then once the population grows too big to sustain itself, and I also believe that the government was centered on consensus, and once your population reaches a certain size, it's very hard to produce consensus anymore. And Trowbridge then describes one family group breaking away and moving downstream and starting a new village. But those villages grow in size then to be far beyond families. And so we don't know how the clan system functioned. If there were clans, then likely each village had all of the clans in it as they spread. And so in time, these villages grew up like this. And in fact, these villages down here are the people that get called Wea and Pinšiwa, who are today a part of the Peoria tribe of Oklahoma. They originally split off from other Myaamia villages and moved downstream. And originally, Waiatanwa, Wea, was just another Myaamia village, as was Pinšiwa, just another Myaamia village. Does that answer your question? Other questions? We still got a little bit of time before lunch because they haven't pulled the shutters back.
Mr. Richardville, his father was European, and mother was full-blood Myaamia. Right. At that period of time, what was the Myaamia population? Is there any roundabout idea?
That is a really good question. That is difficult to answer.
Because there were so many different. But they all, at one point in time, had to be in communication with one another.
Absolutely. Yeah, all these villages were in constant communication with each other. Constant intermarriage between the villages, and then constant movement, especially when people went out to hunt, they would interact a lot.
So you're talking like thousands?
Yeah, definitely thousands. So by the time population collapse occurs, so removal in 1846, estimates are between 600 and 1,000. That shows you even in 1840, the range is like plus or minus 400, right? But so 600 to 1,000 in 1846. People say pre-contact maybe 25,000 Myaamias. That's sort of on the high end. And I would be willing to bet by the Treaty of Greenville, the population is over 5,000, but not over 10. So between 5 and 10 is an estimate. It's very hard to do population numbers in that period of time because populations are calculated with documents, and there are no documents really from the Greenville period. So is that enough of an estimate?
Yeah. Hey, she must have been a very smart woman, because she probably had good connections with European trades.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and marriage was a form of alliance building for Myaamia people. And so if you look at Richardville's decision to marry a Haudenosaunee woman, an Iroquoian woman, that then builds an alliance when the Iroquois were very, very influential in the East. And intermarriage with indigenous people was seen as a form of alliance building. By making you family, you became a part of my alliance. And it was also then used with Europeans to do the same thing. It was a way to take in outsiders and change them from strangers to family and build trust. In the case of Richardville, he turned out to be not very worthy of that trust. But then in our community, the woman has the power to say, get out. And he had to leave with all of his goods. There's a really awesome court document from 1774 where he tries to sue her to get all of her stuff. And she goes into court with the British and says, no, Pakana, her brother, and Little Turtle are there. And they say, no, this is all her belongings. He brought none of that with him. When he leaves, he can leave with the shirt in his back, and that's it. So you can see that all playing out in these documents. Other questions? Yeah, let me repeat these questions so you can all hear it. She was asking, in the case of Myaamia leaders, both men and women, but also maybe even beyond the leadership realm, when you marry outside the community, What about the children? What about the spouse? What's their status sort of going forward in the community? So anthropologists use a term that they like called fictive kinship. So when the Myamis decide to start calling someone they've taken into their family by the term, let's say, Nusa, father, well, that's fictive because it's not biological, is what they say. But for Myaamia people, what's important is the term you use to refer to that person and what that symbolizes, meaning how do they behave towards you and how do you behave towards them. And if Nusa, because Nusa, keep in mind, even within biology, refers to my birth father and all of his brothers. So it doesn't just mean, like in Euro-American thought, just the birth father. It means a whole bunch of people. And all those people have a certain set of responsibilities to you as their child. If another Nusa enters the picture, let's say who's adopted in, a captive, and they're adopted in and they become Nusa, as long as they live into that name and they treat you like they're supposed to treat you and you treat them like you're supposed to treat them, they are a part of the community. They become a part of the family. There's no fiction about it. It's real. And when intermarriage occurs in that same way and you're made a part of the family through marriage, that's the creation of alliance. There's an exchange of goods that occurs between the two families, and there's a recognition that the children are going to live with one community usually, but maintain their connections to the other. And so in the cases of people who marry in from other tribes, they may then, it may be negotiated, they're going to live with the Myaami family, but they're going to maintain, let's say, their connections with the Kickapoo. That's important in a lot of different ways. One, it means that these kids are not half citizens. They're not half members of the village. If the village is a community, you're a child of the community, you're a part of the community. But they're also allowed to maintain their connections, let's say, with the Kickapoo, their linguistic connections, their family connections. So if you ever need to come to the Kickapoo and say, we need your help, that's the young person you're going to send. So when you look at someone like Pinšiwa, who's born of a French father and a Myaamia mother, who goes to Montreal and learns how to read and write French and Latin, but then lives the rest of his life in Myaami villages, except during the War of 1812 when he flees, like everyone had to. He is Myaamia, but he maintains his connections with the French. He can utilize those alliances. He can utilize his skills and his knowledge to maintain those alliances. And that transfers later to the British and to American traders as well, as he learns how the economic functions work in those groups. And so that knowledge can only be created because his community sort of shared him with outside groups, while he always came back to live with those people. I see no examples prior to allotment of status being halves and quarters and thirds. You either were Myaamia or you weren't. And you can go back and you can actually look at the cases of people who are getting land grants in the treaty years. And the dispute isn't their percentage. The dispute is they don't associate with us in the community. They don't live with us, therefore they're not of us. It's the living with us that makes you of us, not the color of your skin, how much you are. That language does not show up until the US government uses blood quantum in the allotment years. That's the first time it starts to show up in Myaami communities. Does that answer your question?
George, so I assume that's happening on the opposite way too, that there are members of the Myaamia communities who are moving out to the other tribes and kind of adopting their communities.
Absolutely.
And so they're almost like removed Myaamia, but they become part of the other tribes.
Yeah, and that leads to, I'm sure if those of you who live down here know there's all kinds of joking about that. You know, like, we know you're really Myaami, or they'll say something like, we know you're really Quapaw. And in Indiana, there's a lot of marriage that way into the Potawatomis up here. And in their community today, they still joke all the time, oh, you're really Myaami anyway. You know, that's how they answer disputes in their community. And actually, in the case of removal, there's two family groups who actually do that. They escape removal by moving up with their Potawatomi relatives who are exempted. And so it becomes a tool to survive in very, very difficult times. That's family, right? It's really just family, the way family works. Family help each other, right? That's what they're doing. And over time then, those people don't speak Myaamia anymore. If they speak anything, they speak Potawatomi. If they have cultural habits and they maintain histories, they're mostly Potawatomi now, with some knowledge of a Myaami past, but they don't associate with the Myaami anymore. So yeah, really good question. And that occurs, like Megan's saying, everywhere. So we have relatives out there everywhere. Yeah?
we ever have any other tribes that came to us and came to us because they wanted to live with us and became part of the...
That they became incorporated in?
Right. Was there any of that?
There likely was, especially in the pre-contact period where we don't have our own oral tradition of that period of time. I can say it likely happened. The only close example in the historical record is the Delaware, but they never actually incorporated into us. They just lived next to us and were treated with respect, but they never were incorporated wholesale. Beyond one Delaware chief, Silverheels. But again, there's intermarriage there, and that's what leads to the incorporation. There's a small hint. Richardville describes 2 origin stories to someone in the 1820s. And the guy totally misunderstands what Richardville's doing. And he actually says, what he told me didn't make any sense, and I don't trust him anyway, so I'm not going to listen to what he said. And he actually, when you read it, he describes the emergence story. The guy says, grabs a hold of tree limbs, comes out of the water, all of it, which is in our emergence story. And then he says, and there's a separate story of climbing out of the earth. And it's possible then that it's a story of another group of people who joined us, and they have their own story of where they came from, and Richardville remembered a part of it. And over time, that story has been lost to us, and all that's remembered is the emergence story up here. So there's little threads like that. Other questions? All right. Well, as we break for lunch, feel free to swarm. All right, before I launch into part 2 of the presentation, I thought I'd start with questions in case anyone has to leave towards the end before we finish, or anything came to mind while you were mulling over your meal. Any questions or thoughts? Or yeah, Brad?
What was the structure of a village? What if you walked into a Myaamia village? What would it look like?
All right, so Brad's question was very much a geographer's one, right? If you walked into a Myaamia village, what would it look like? What would the shape of it be? That's a really good question that we don't actually have a lot of source material on. And we have a few maps that draw what Myaamia villages look like from the 1790s. And it looks like because our villages were always just outside the yearly floodplain along rivers, that they basically follow that floodplain line. So our villages weren't formed in circles, which would be sort of the natural mindset of how you'd form a Myaamia village. They were kind of long, irregular shapes that followed that floodplain. And they would just build as many lodges as they needed. At the center of that irregular shape would have been the lodge of the leader, the akima, which was actually his wife or grandmother or mother's lodge. And so it was usually at the center of the village. And then visitors were greeted at the edge. So all along outside of that would have been just other dwellings of various sizes based on the families. So small wikiame, like you'd see in the museum if you go into the headquarters in Megan's exhibit. That's a really small wikiame. That's either a wikiame you'd see in a hunting camp or for a very small family. And they would grow in size to be 25 feet across for bigger families. Once you had a bigger family than that, that's where you started to move towards a longhouse, because the structure begins to lose its integrity if you keep going out in dome-shaped. And so you'd see different size lodges all over this village based on how big the family was. Outside of that, you'd find structures during the right time of year for drying corn, beans, and squash, although we grew far less beans and squash than other groups. And so all the agricultural stuff would be on the fringes towards where the community fields were. The community fields would usually be down in the floodplain where they plant as the water receded in the spring, and up outside the floodplain so that, because the stuff in the floodplain was always at risk of being washed away. So there's various levels of risk in the different kinds of planting. Let me see if I'm forgetting anything from the village. Oh, then usually associated with each village was a burial ground. And that was located based on where you weren't going to get graves washed away, sort of separate from the village, but nearby, because graveyards were regularly visited, sort of communal spaces. They weren't taboo. Just like today, we always go to hang out in Myaamia graveyards to sort of go visiting. It was like that way in our past, too. Did I miss anything, Brad? No? Okay. Other questions? All right, feel free to stop me throughout. Everyone just ate lunch, so I know everyone's going to start nodding off now. So this is the hopefully the more interesting part of the presentation in terms of we're going to get to some of the issues that I think it's fair to say are controversial within our community today. And talking about that, I think, can be a useful thing at certain points in our history. But feel free to stop me throughout, too, so we can keep everyone engaged and keep a conversation going and no one starts nodding off. You can also feel free to poke your neighbor. As long as they're not an elder, you can poke them and keep them awake. I'd appreciate that. So where I left off was the beginning of the War of 1812. And I like to describe our history using that streamlined outline, but also in sort of 3 different paths that I see in our history that sort of move without dates necessarily. And the first path is our natural path. It's the way we lived in this space before the massive disruptions that came either in the Beaver Wars or 80 years later with the invasions of the Americans. In our first path, that's the Myaamia path. We could basically live a Myaamia life without anyone interfering in that. It doesn't mean our lives were perfect. People died, there was famine, there was disease. Sometimes, the Cherokee came up and they would raid one of our villages, so there was violence. But for the most part, no one could force us to change the way we lived our lives. We could change sort of as we saw fit, according completely to our own cultural norms. That's our first path. Again, so there's change there. It's not written in stone, but it's our path. We determine where it goes. Our second path is what happens after the Treaty of Greenville. And it's one in which we try to create a system of alliances with the Americans that allow us to find a new way to live as our land is lost, as hunting diminishes. So even before we lose hunting grounds, like let's say here in southern Indiana, the hunting is already diminished in quality. The white-tailed deer populations drop. The bison, actually, the eastern bison, disappear completely. Massive source of protein, completely gone. The eastern elk very quickly go extinct. And so hunting declines. And it's in this period after the Treaty of Greenville that they try and figure out, essentially, what's our new economy going to be? Now, they didn't describe it that way, but they're essentially asking, how are we going to feed ourselves? How are we going to clothe ourselves? How are we going to house ourselves? How are we going to care for ourselves? Those are the things of an economy. In that second path, they're trying to do it through alliance building. They're trying to create a system of alliances as they understand them with the Americans, meaning the Americans are going to need us as much as we need them. Therefore, we can continue to work this out. The War of 1812 destroys that path because most Myaamia people, and this isn't completely clear in the historical record, some historians disagree about it, but the more I've researched it, the more it's pretty clear that most Myaamia people did not side with Tecumseh, Tenskwatawa, or the British until after our villages were burned. Before that, we tried to maintain a neutral stance. We did not want to fight against Noosa, our father, the Americans. We were in alliance with them. We also did not want to fight against the Shawnee. We did not want to fight against the Wyandot. We did not want to fight against our grandfathers, the Delaware. But what William Henry Harrison and other American leaders asked us to do in 1811 and 1812 was pick a side. And the literal quote from William Henry Harrison is, "I will draw a line in the dirt, and you have to pick your side. If you hold me by the hand, then you will join us, essentially, in fighting your siblings. Or, if you're not going to hold me by the hand, then you're on their side, and my warriors are moving." That's actually the phrase he uses, meaning we're coming to your villages. And so there shall be no neutrals here. You cannot stand on both sides of the line and hold my hand and hold their hand. That choice is not available to you, is what Harrison tells them. They try it anyway, and they actually say to him, "We're going to try it. We're going to hold your hand, and we're going to hold your hand really tight." This is what Charlie Katonga tells him. "And we're going to hold our brothers, the Shawnees, we're going to hold them a little loose in case something goes wrong." Meaning, if things go wrong, maybe we'll let go of them, but we'll hold on to you. But we're not letting go of them. They are our brothers. That doesn't work. And after the northern frontier collapses, after Dearborn falls, after Detroit falls, you have waves of northern indigenous people come to Fort Wayne, and they lay siege to what was our largest village, and our people flee. And Tecumseh's message to the Myamis at this point as they advance on Fort Wayne is, "Get out of my way or I will crush you beneath my boot." That's what Tecumseh told our people. So clearly we were not in alliance with Tecumseh. But because we didn't join the Americans against them, we were viewed as an enemy group because there shall be no neutrals. And after the siege of Fort Wayne, all of our villages on the fringes of Fort Wayne on the Eel River and at the Forks of the Wabash were burned. All of our people had to flee. Some of them fled as far as Fat Lake in Illinois. Some of them fled down to the Mississinewa River, which is a secluded river valley. Some of them fled to Canada. Some of them fled to places we probably don't know about anymore. The next winter, all the villages on the Mississinewa were burned. So the refugees of the refugees were then refugees again. And then later, a year later, all of our villages in the Wabash were burned yet again in 1813 by Russell. So by the winter of 1812, hundreds of Miami men did join the British. But it's important to note that they didn't actually link up with Tecumseh. They never actually associated much with Tecumseh. They linked up with the Wyandot, who some of their war leaders were held in very high esteem, Roundhead especially. And Miami warriors were associated with the Wyandot in their alliance with the British. After Roundhead died, the Miamis left the British alliance. So that period was transformative. And the War of 1812 in American history is a forgotten war. It's very rarely talked about. This is its anniversary year, so it's getting some press. That's the only reason why, is because of a nice round number, the number 200, so people are focused on it. Otherwise, it goes forgotten, and much so in our own history. But it's a very important war because it destroys that second path. We cannot work in terms of alliance with the Americans anymore. Treaties were an alliance. They were a system of reciprocal exchange to build a relationship with the Americans. And what we got out of it was utter and complete destruction. And so the ending of that conflict, this is an etching of Tecumseh's death, which is actually was made long after it in the late 1800s. And here's another etching. After the war, Tecumseh becomes this very popular person, surprisingly. Hated and feared in 1811 by everyone who was an American citizen. Becomes idolized by the 1890s as, the greatest example of American Indian leadership. And I like to joke, why? Well, because he's dead, and therefore he's safe. Whereas people who struggle on, who try and find a way to survive, they get judged as sellouts, as cowards, as venal, as greedy. But the Indians who died, they're the noble ones, right? Because this is what Americans wanted. They wanted Indians to go away. Either get out and go past the Mississippi or die. People who try to find a way to live on were resented. So the leaders who lived out this transition, who were civil leaders from beginning to end, can be shown really, across just 3 generations, the massive change they had to deal with. And really, if you really want to focus on the massive change, it occurs in 1 generation, which is a pretty serious amount of change to deal with. In Pakana's lifetime, for most of his life, he got to live that first path. There were difficulties, as I said. There were changes they had to deal with, but it was their path. By the time he died, everything had changed. He died after the War of 1812. The next major leader, Pinšiwa, Jean-Baptiste Richardville, lived through the most rapid period of decline of our land base and the difficulties of trying to figure out how we're going to survive as a nation. And then the last leader, Tupia, lived through our forced removal and actually died returning from it to bring 5 other leaders back home to get their families exempted from removal. So he died returning back to Indiana to make a trip to DC to get 5 additional families, perhaps numbering as much as 100, 120 people, exempted from removal. He died in that act. He got sick on the return journey. So what we're going to focus on is how that transition occurred, how it led to removal, and some of the new questions we can ask about that experience. Like I said, I'm not going to be able to give you a lot of answers, but we should have some new questions today. And what's going to be interesting is to note the language. This is from the 1830s, coming from someone like Pinšiwa. The Miamis will never consent to leave the homes of their fathers. We have answered more than once that we will not sell, and still you ask us for land. And he goes on to say we're not selling our land in what becomes the state of Indiana. That kind of harsh language from him that is very clearly recognizing that the Americans are not our friends. So this second path has been abandoned. We're not in peaceful alliance with the Americans. We're also not fighting them. Instead, we're doing something new. This continues all the way until 1838, and then it abruptly changes. So it leads to one of our great questions: what happened in 1838 and 1840 that all of a sudden these leaders were agreeing to the idea of removal? The other quote that we have to keep in mind as we're looking at this period is that Pinšiwa says, "Father, I have told you I do not speak for myself, but for my people. What you hear from me is the voice of the Myamis." There are at least 10 other examples of Miami leaders saying something just like this at treaty negotiations, because they were constantly being accused by the Americans of representing their desires. And they pushed back and said, no, I'm here representing the voice of my community. It's going to be important to keep that in mind when we look at the 1838 and 1840 treaties, because a lot of the discussion around those treaties is as though it was Richardville's sole decision. And I think there's enough ground to ask, was it really his sole decision? I think there's enough ground to ask that question. Again, I don't know the answer to it, but now there's enough ground to ask it. So after the War of 1812, so this is 1795, Treaty of Greenville, late 1700s, 1809. So this center space is all that's legally Myaamia in 1809. After the War of 1812, 1818 Treaty of St. Mary's. All that's left in this downward portion is this square here, which becomes the Great Reserve. 1826 Treaty of the Mississinawa. All the northern land is gone. So by 1830, all that's left to Miami people is 500,000 acres in north central Indiana, what's called the Great Miami Reserve. So in one lifetime, our economy went from drawing on this whole space to feed, clothe, and house ourselves to 500,000 acres. Now our population dwindled in this same period, but even for, let's say, 1,000 people, that is not enough land to feed ourselves effectively based on our old practices. Now all people have to change. That's the reality of life on this planet. But how quickly you have to change and what other pressures, what other forces are in place as you try to change, determine the health of your community as you make those changes. And determine whether those changes get to be mediated by your desires or whether they're forced on you by outsiders. And the question is, how much of the changes around this were mediated by our own cultural beliefs and practices, and how much of it was forced? That's a question, again, that we don't necessarily know all the answers to. But that is the challenge that Pinšiwa, the other leaders, and their communities were forced to address. This is the momentous challenge they have to face. They've been to DC, they've been to Baltimore, they've been to New York. They see what's out here. They've then seen the population pressure. They've then seen what happens if they try to walk this neutral space. And then they've watched their land decline. So they know what they're up against. That's what they're facing in these treaty years. And I want to make that very clear as we go into the last section here. What I think I'm finding as I begin to look at removal based on not the 1840 treaty, but based on what happened in the War of 1812, for me now, that's where removal begins. Removal begins in the failures around the War of 1812. And what I'm beginning to find is a whole different train of thought that exists between and being shared by numerous indigenous communities. Numerous American Indian tribes are sharing ideas somehow, and I don't know how. It's either just simple copying, they see it happening someplace else, they learn about it and they copy it, or perhaps they're actually interacting with each other. This is a great question I don't know the answer to. But I do know the kids of all of these people were interacting with each other at boarding schools. I know in some cases, families intermarried. And I know from a few historical references that people actually met and discussed things. And so this is what I tentatively call a confederacy of lawyers, because they're now going to engage in the treaty process. That hasn't changed since before the War of 1812. We signed the 1795 Treaty of Greenville, the 1803 and the 1809 treaties, right? So the treaties continue, but what changes after the War of 1812 is the attitude. Now it is furious legal resistance. So they're going to use legal tools to fight the Americans. So it's warfare of a certain kind, but it's legal warfare. It's warfare that takes place at the treaty table, in the courtroom, in lobbying with representatives in your own state or territory, and in DC. So it becomes something that begins to look like politics today, right? Which is oftentimes associated with warfare, right? People use warfare metaphor to talk about politics. That's what begins to happen, I think, in this period. So we're going to talk a bit about the other efforts going on around us. The Myaamia did not exist in a void, right? I talked about all the people that shared our landscape with us. Well, they all experienced relatively similar things, and how they responded to those things taught us lessons, as well as how we responded to things taught them lessons. So the other people in this image, in case you don't know all of them, this is John Ross, the chief of the Cherokees, the principal chief of the Cherokees, most associated with really the successful legal resistance to removal. He actually was successful. They won their Supreme Court case. And then Andrew Jackson just said, I don't care, and he removed him anyway. Or really let Georgia remove him. So a great example of successful political resistance. This is William Walker, Jr., who's Wyandotte, and a great leader of the Wyandotte resistance to removal. The Wyandotte weren't removed from Ohio until 1843. That's 3 years before us. So I can't help but think that other leaders right next door, because the Wyandotte Reserve, although it's in Ohio, is actually right near the headwaters of all of our historic rivers. So it's a place we used to travel to all the time. We have a long history with Wyandottes. I can't help but think there was some, at least, knowledge of the joint efforts to resist. And what I see are shared tactics. So I see a lot of the same tactics used. And the last person here is Leopold Pokagon, who's a representative of what becomes the Pokagon Band of Potawatomis today. They're oftentimes called the St. Joseph Potawatomis or the Catholic Potawatomis. And he also, of the three of these men, he's the lone individual who's successful in exempting his entire group from removal. The Pokagons exist today in southern Michigan because of his and other leaders' efforts to get them exempted. So he's the lone successful example here. John Ross was successful on paper, but he couldn't actually stop the troops. William Walker ended up being unsuccessful, and Pinšiwa, John Baptiste Richardville, was also unsuccessful. So as I said, I see the treaty period as an extension of our wars with the Americans. And it sets up removal, which is, I think it's fair to say, a failure of those attempts to resist. Just like John Ross ultimately failed, he was politically successful. He won in the Supreme Court of the United States, laid down 2 of the 3 cardinal cases that tribes use today to establish their right to exist as sovereign entities in the US. He laid that down, but he ultimately was unsuccessful because he couldn't stop the troops from forcibly removing his people. And so the removal is a failure of this process. But understanding it can help us understand how we got to where we are today, and then better understand the legitimacy of the political tools we use today to reinforce and defend our nation. The symbol of this for me is, this is in one of those community histories produced in Fort Wayne. This is an etching of the last council house. And they call it the last council house because they like to name last things in Indiana and actually across the Midwest. The last Indian princess, the last Indian chief, the last Indian chief's house, and this is the last council house. But what's really interesting about this one is, in the War of 1812, the council house that existed before it, where people came to negotiate with the Americans, was burned down during the siege of Fort Wayne. And so then a new council house was rebuilt on its site. And it's a wonderful symbol to me of the change that occurred before and after the War of 1812, because the tone and tenure of the councils changed. And so the new council house is built, and perhaps it looked like the old one, but what occurred there was very, very different now. That council house doesn't exist anymore today in Fort Wayne. So this is where we sat in terms of land after the War of 1812. We actually did a peace treaty with the Americans in 1813 and a second treaty with the Americans in 1816 for peace. Neither of those treaties were land treaties. So we didn't give anything to the Americans and we didn't get anything from the Americans in those treaties. Those were purely attempts to reestablish peace after the war. And one of the other reasons why they weren't a land treaty is that William Henry Harrison, who was the major person behind the 1809 treaty, which ceded this part of Indiana, actually took a lot of heat on the East Coast from East Coast American politicians because they saw that treaty as a cause for Tecumseh's militancy against the US. And he took a lot of heat on the East Coast. Again, if you don't know your history of the War of 1812, there were states on the northern seaboard in New England who wanted to secede from the Union over the War of 1812. That's how upset they were over what happened. So they saw William Henry Harrison, a Virginian, a Kentuckian, an Indianian, a frontiersman, as the cause of all their grief. He wanted to be president one day. And so he had to respect the political winds. And that's why there's no land treaty in this part of the country until 1818 for our people. At that treaty, things have changed. We come to the table in a very different spirit. And we give up a pretty large slice of our homelands. But we don't give it up lightly. This is what begins to change. And this is what Benjamin Park was getting at in his quote that I gave you at the beginning of this morning, is he says, Richardville is greedy and he's shrewd. Well, all the Miamis were being shrewd. They knew what land was going for to settlers per acre. And if they were going to exchange it in a treaty, they were going to get every last penny of its value in return. So they were playing a game now where our resources have dwindled. We cannot hunt in the way we used to. We cannot farm in the way we used to. And we've just been through a war where all of our agricultural supplies have been burned to the ground 3 times over, and we're struggling to rebuild. And if we're going to be brought to the negotiating table and asked to relinquish land, and in some cases have our arms twisted to relinquish land, we're going to push back and get everything we can for it. They begin to create a new economy around treaties. So treaties become the means by which they feed themselves. They had to have recognized this was temporary. They knew it wasn't a gravy train that was going to last forever. But they were actually going to feed themselves, clothe themselves, and house themselves through the annuities they got from treaties. So the annuities were going to last quite a while. They were going to be yearly payments based on, let's say, the 1818 treaty. And every family would get a set amount of money every year based on that treaty. They knew it wasn't going to last forever, but it was going to last numerous years. The idea is, in that period of time, on this last bit of land, you can begin to figure out a new economy. Right, it's in this period of time that Pinšiwa meets the representatives of the Cherokees in Baltimore. And all the historical record says is that he discussed their efforts to improve themselves. In the beginning in 1817, moving through removal for the Cherokees, they began a nationalization campaign. They created a newspaper. They brought a written language that had just been created to print their language. They created farms that ran on the American economic model as well as communal farms. They had both. They created a constitutional form of government that borrowed a little bit from the Americans and also from their own cultural traditions. And they did all of this to show Georgia that they deserved to stay in Georgia. They had to prove they were civilized. And they had to hate that. They had to spit when they knew they had to do that. But they had to do it if they wanted to stay. Why? Because the writing was on the wall. Lots of groups had left already. The Shawnee, some of them left before the Treaty of Greenville. Others left after the War of 1812. The Delaware, gone. The Kickapoo, gone. The Sac and Fox, gone from this area. The Peoria and Piankashaw and Wea actually split off and leave before our forced removals. These are removals of a different kind. They didn't happen at the end of a bayonet, but they were still forced because they were left with a choice. Stay here and starve, or go west, get new lands, and find a new way to feed yourselves, a new way to survive. And many groups were removed. So the Cherokee, the Wyandot, the Pokagon Potawatomi, the Miamis saw this. This whole landscape was being emptied of our relatives by force of various kinds. So they knew what was coming. They didn't have to like it or dislike it. They saw what was coming. In 1826, Treaty of the Mississinewa, the Miamis give up most of northern Indiana. And again, the terms are very, very strong. People have done comparisons, our population based other tribes with acreage, and the Miamis were coming out farther ahead in this process than any other tribe in terms of the amount of money per acre they were getting. Now keep in mind, take Lake County, Indiana, for example. This is already full of squatters. So technically, this land up here is ours on paper, but it's already full of squatters. And if we go up there and we're like, we'd like to hunt or fish here along the lakeshore here, we'd be run out at the point of a gun because there are squatters living there and they already have plans for that land. So while this looks like it's ours, it's not. What we're selling is lands that's already been stolen from us, just not on paper yet. And then all the land's gone and the troops show up and the tribe is split in two and people are removed, right? And people focus on the genuinely horrifying moment where people are loaded onto boats and torn from their homelands. It's genuinely horrifying. That part of the story is absolutely 100% correct, both in terms of fact and emotion. But by focusing solely on that moment and the emotion, the pain of it, we forget to look at what led to it. Why is that important? Because we're living out the legacy of that to this day. It doesn't change the pain of the moment at all. It doesn't change the historical reality of the moment. But it does lead us to reconsider where we are today. So as you go back and you look at removal differently, I've begun to look at it as actually removal begins in the War of 1812. That's when it's set up. And then you begin to look at all the documents again, the stuff you've read hundreds of times. All of a sudden, things you never thought of before pop out at you. This is a great example. Read a lot about removal, heard stories about it as a Myaamia youth, heard people talk about it in Indiana, heard people talk about it here, saw all the raw emotion around it. Read the removal letters numerous times, great series of documents that describe this very painful process of forced removal. But it was only after going back and looking at the setup for removal differently and then rereading the letters again that this really popped out at me. And what really struck me, I'll read it to you first, I'll read it to you in a second, but what really struck me is no historian who writes about removal takes this quote seriously. Most of them never even talk about it. This is from the letter from the headmen of the Myamis in Kansas back to the President of the United States upon completing removal. And this is what they said. This is the whole group, all the leaders. So this letter to the president is explaining, it opens with, "We're sorry it took so long for us to remove." They're apologizing for the removal. You imagine the pain of that, because they were supposed to leave long before 1846. And then they say, "Well, we have removed and we're here now." And then they launch into this. They're trying to explain what happened. And their explanation is that some people told us, and they call them designing white men, told us that you all have enough individual tracts of land that you just need to give up your great collective reserve, the 500,000 acres, and then you can all just distribute with all your family groups across those lands. And you won't ever actually have to leave, which is a quote I've heard from Miami people. We signed the treaty, but we thought we'd never actually have to go. Well, this explains a part of that, perhaps. Why would they think that? Because there's actually quite a bit of land at this point controlled by individual Miami families they all could have lived on. It was quite possible. It didn't work out that way, and we'll get to talking about that in a second. But no one takes that quote seriously. Why not? Are they just lying? Maybe. But why not explore it a little bit and see? Because they're already removed. Maybe they think they're going to get to go back by lying? Maybe. But I think there's a large, large kernel of truth to that quote. And why? Because there are all these examples of resistance to removal to draw on. So take the Cherokees, for example, right? I talked about John Ross's failure. He's winning in the Supreme Court, but his nation still gets forcibly removed. A horrible, horrible experience for the Cherokees. Well, what isn't oftentimes talked about are the Cherokees who stay behind. When it is talked about, it's merely some Cherokees ran across the border and hid out, is what people talk about. But that's only half the story, actually. The other half of the story is that 300 to 500 Cherokees were offered fee simple land in North Carolina, and they could stay. They were legally staying in North Carolina. And they had the help of North Carolina state politicians, because the Cherokee Nation's challenges were with the government of Georgia. North Carolina, actually, in the Qualla boundary, wanted them to stay. And I don't know enough to know why, but they actually invited them and they helped them through this process. So perhaps as many as 500 Cherokees got to stay by building some kind of alliance with local state politicians. People who, if betrayed you, might get called deceiving white men. But in this case, they weren't betrayed, and they're still there to this day. Those who hid out and ran from the Cherokee Trail of Tears joined them and hid out on their lands, And the Eastern Cherokee Nation is still there to this day. Pokagon Band of Potawatomi. 4 separate villages of Potawatomi. There's a lot of Myaamia intermarriage here with this group. At the 1833 Treaty of Chicago, Leopold Pokagon gets exemption for those 4 villages. And what he does is he makes a very strong argument that they are civilized. And the center of his argument is that they are Catholics. And he makes this claim saying they are practicing dutiful Catholics. They live on independent farms that look just like their American neighbors. And he has Catholic leadership who support him in these claims. So he has allies in the Catholic Church. They then move onto first collective lands near Dowagiac, Michigan, and then onto fee simple land that Leopold Pokagon helps buy for them. Fee simple land means that that land is held by them in title. It can be sold, it can be claimed for debt. It's just like every other American's land, except for one thing, they're not citizens of the US. So they have no legal rights, they can't go into court, but their land is fee simple, which is something that the settlers wanted. They wanted to end to this collective shared Indian land base. And so all of these Pokagon Potawatomi, they stay. The Department of War actually says, what the heck are all you Potawatomi doing here? We thought you moved you out. And they go to bring the troops in. And Leopold Pokagon goes into court in Detroit in 1839, I think it is. He goes into court in Detroit and gets a judge in Detroit to issue a writ against the Department of War and stops their forced removal. So it is possible in 1839 to stop a forced removal. He gets a judge in Detroit to take his side because he says, look at this treaty. This says we get to stay. So stop the army from staying. And the judge issues the writ and he says, if the soldiers come and get you, send me a message and I will issue another writ of habeas corpus, which means release them, and I will have you forcibly released from the US government. So you have a state judge taking a side against the US government, Department of War, and they stay. They're still there to this day. Some less successful examples, but still examples to look at, especially because they're so nearby. The Wyandot in Ohio end up on a small great reserve. It's actually smaller than our reserve. And they're engaging in some American-style farming. But they develop a series of alliances with Methodist preachers and create a Methodist mission on their land. And using the Methodists and interacting with them, becoming allies with them, they then are able to campaign against removal. And they're able to stop it for quite a while. They stay in Ohio long after the rest of the tribes have been removed. And in 1842, for reasons that, again, aren't really clear for them, their leadership agrees to a removal, and they're forcibly removed in 1843. Now, what's important to note is that this wasn't the first close call they had. They had a previous close call with removal, and they actually organized a group of their leaders to go out west and look at their lands. And then they came back and they said, yeah, those lands are no good, we're not going to move. And the Department of War folks who were trying to get this removal were incredibly frustrated. They felt betrayed by the Wyandots. But it worked for that time. And then it cropped up again. And this time it wasn't successful. Their community had fragmented, actually in half, had divided on issues having to do with religion and culture. And that internal division led them to sign this treaty, at least in part. Another example of a failed removal, and this is the last one I'll draw on, is from the Potawatomis. 1838 was the Potawatomi Trail of Death. They were walked out west, and lots of children died. It was a terrible experience for them. They had far more deaths than Miami people did on our forced removal. And then a bunch of them just turned around and walked home too, and went back up with the Pokagons. But in 1839, they tried another removal for people who weren't in the Trail of Death. And they simply put out a call, we're going to remove you and you need to come down to Logansport and then we'll load you onto boats. We're going to remove you by boat this time. This is Logansport, Indiana. And they negotiated and they got 10 or 20 people to show up, but to do a removal, they needed at least 100. There's actually letters that say it. We need at least 100 people to do this forced removal. And they couldn't get 100. And they negotiated for a whole another year and they got another couple people to come in and they couldn't get 100. So they finally just threw up their hands and said, everybody go home, this is over with. And they all went home. Just like that, forced removal over with. Now, I'm not saying life was easy for this group, but they successfully stopped that removal. Right, so it was possible in this period of time to do it, to stop a removal. The other thing I'll mention about this, and it plays in key in our forest removal is that the people handling the removal were operating at the orders of the Department of War, which handled Indian affairs, but they were independent contractors. They were not employees of the US federal government, most of them. And so their sole interest was profit. And if you can make the removal, like this case, not profitable for them, they were going to walk away from it because they were interested in one thing. They were removing Indians to make money. That's it. So if you take that and you look at it in terms of geography, here's our homelands. Within this bubble are actually all of those individual family reserve lands. And then our national reserve, which existed up until 1840, was right here. This is where Leopold Pokagon got his group exempted at Dowagiac. Interesting enough, this is our emergence river. Here's our place of emergence. This is where they're living. Right? This is where a bunch of Myaamia people actually flee when they want to escape our removal. So they're right there. We had to know what was going on with them. I see no documentary evidence of that, but I think we had to. The failed removal occurred right here at Logansport. Tons of Myaamia people living around Logansport. So they watched it happen. They watched it, probably feeling for these people, and then they watched it failed, and they probably felt good for them to see it not happen. And then here are the Wyandots. Again, erase state boundaries in your mind. Look at how close that is. And the people involved with the Wyandots, John Johnston, the American agent, was here. Tipton, who was involved with a lot of our treaties, was operating in this area. So there's all kinds of crossover, different flows of information that we probably don't even know about anymore. And then here's other removals in more national terms. This is an Indian country map of 2010, but you can see here's our heartlands. Here's the two Potawatomi failed removals. Here's the Wyandotte who resisted until 1843. And then here's the North Carolina Cherokees, right, who just moved over from Georgia into North Carolina, and that's how the Eastern Cherokees exist today. This one is more distant, but as I said, there's some clues that Richardville met the leaders of the Cherokees in Baltimore. And so he may have heard some of their strategies. They may have, in fact, shared strategies, much like tribes shared strategies when they were fighting against the US government in military terms. They might have shared strategies now that they're fighting against the US in legal terms. We can't know for sure right now, but I actually think on Pinšiwa's trip to DC, there might be documentation that we haven't found yet. Their visits with the War Department were almost always heavily documented. And so it's possible that we'll find records, if we go looking, of his interaction with the Cherokees and maybe even learn what was shared. So when you do that, you can look at treaties in a very different light. Instead of solely being a story of land loss, they are still about land loss. I'm not going to deny that. It's absolutely seminal and central to treaties. It's about land loss. But in addition, it's about some other things now. So in 1818, we give up land for a really, really steep price. And the Americans are very resentful of how shrewd we are at the negotiating table. We also create the first fee simple land patents. And these go to Pinšiwa, to Richardville. This is where people first start claiming that he's only interested in enriching himself. But this, think of it like a wedge being driven in a door. He's the first one to get a fee simple land patent, tiny little wedge. But then you can knock it all the way through. And what you see after this is more and more families getting land patents. Beyond just Richardville, beyond just Godfrey, lots of other families are getting patents, which means they can use this land to say, see, we're civilized like you, right? Just like Pokagon does in the north. And so we should get to stay. We can be just like you. Inside, they may hate having to say that, but legally, to stay, they have to make an argument that they're civilized. That's what the rules of the game require after the Indian Removal Act. They also create protected individual land grants. So they now have 3 types of land in the community. Now you can think about trust land today and think about how interesting this is. 3 types of land. There's the community reserve. There's actually, in this period of time, 3 of them. Large land, hundreds of thousands of acres, held by the whole group in common. Can be used by the whole group for hunting, fishing, farming. Then there's fee simple land, held by individuals, and they can buy and sell it. They can trade it for debt. They can borrow against it. And protected land grants that are held by individuals, but they can't be sold without the approval of the president. So it's an individual land that's less risky. because it can't just disappear. It can't just be taken for debt. The president protects that land and must sign any bill of sale. So they have 3 types of land from which to mount this defense. And when you look at the treaties that follow, this grows. 1826 Mississinewa Treaty, they create village reservation grants. So another new type of land. You've got 2 types of individual land. You've got village land and you've got collective land. And you have a huge list. This is a really long list that's been underanalyzed of protected individual land grants. Every Myaamia family had at least one protected individual land grant. Every family. 1834 Forks of the Wabash. This is after the Indian Removal Act now. If you read the transcript in 1826, the negotiators, Lewis Cass, who was one of our enemies in the War of 1812, John Tipton, another enemy from the War of 1812, they were running the negotiation. And they referenced the War of 1812 all the time. You fought against us, now you're going to pay for it. They call for removal in this treaty. They want removal in 1826, and it's fiercely resisted. After the Removal Act is actually passed in 1830, and the removal language is very, very strong again in 1834, but we refuse to agree to removal. More land is relinquished. The other collective reserves are relinquished, so all that's left is the Great Reserve at this point. There's more fee simple land patents made, and there's more protected land grants made. So each time they give up big pieces of land, they get these little pieces in return, as well as there's annuities associated with each of these. There's monetary value. One more thing. The 1834 treaty, most treaties were ratified in the next congressional session. This treaty, Andrew Jackson rejects because removal's not in it. And so it's not ratified until 3 years later. Now, this is important for a couple reasons. One, it's a clear sign that Miamis were successfully resisting removal. That Andrew Jackson knew of our existence was a bad thing. He was not a friend to Indians. He knew of our existence and he wanted us gone, and he had a treaty negotiated at his orders, and we were able to stop removal language from getting in there. That's pretty momentous. Right? He was a forceful person. What he ordered usually happened as president. So it doesn't show up here. He resists it, and it takes 3 years to have this treaty ratified. It's really important that you keep in mind our economy was structured on annuities. So they sign a treaty agreeing to annuities, which is what they're going to use to feed themselves for the next year, and it doesn't get ratified for 3 years. So what are they left with? How are they going to feed themselves in the interim? Well, there's a lot of traders around who are willing to offer food and supplies on a debt system. And when the annuity comes in, they say, then we'll just subtract what you owe us from these debts. Various traders operate with different levels of ethics. Some of them gouge. They charge way, way, way times market value for everything. Some of them deal with us honestly, and some of them fall in between. A few of the traders are Myamis. So 2 prominent examples are Pinšiwa, or Richardville, and Palaneswa, Godfroy. And they actually give goods to their people on credit. And the historical evidence seems to be pretty clear they were doing it at pure market value. What it cost them, really at very little or to no profit, they then extended to their people on credit. The other thing that happened in this period, and this is something I'm just learning about, there's some researchers who are not Miami who are doing this research, is that in this period of time, our people were going into, let's say, the Ewing establishment, and they would come in and say, hi, I'm Wapimangwa, and I would like to get a sack of grain on credit. Well, Ewing doesn't know who Wapimangwa is, doesn't know what family he's attached to. How can he extend this guy credit? How can he actually track him down? Well, Wapimangwa could say, well, you can put down Jean-Baptiste Richardville's name. I'll get credit under his name. And this happens over and over again with the prominent Miami leaders, that people are extended credit based on their name. Because the trader knows if I can't track him down, I do know who Richardville is, and I can get the money from him at the next annuity payment. And so you have this tangled web of debt. People are using debt and annuities to survive. And the Myaamia leaders who are involved in trading are a part of the process of trying to figure out how we're going to survive. Now, it's very tangled. Ethics become very tenuous in this period of time. So I do not know enough to say all Myaamia people who participated in this were 100% ethical all the time. I don't know that. But what I do know is how complicated this was and how close to the edge in terms of starvation our people were in this period of time. They were grasping whatever economic tools they had to feed themselves. Okay? So when this treaty isn't ratified for 3 years, that means big problems. So by the time you show up to the 1838 treaty, in 1837, the treaty is ratified. In 1837, there's also a national economic panic. Right? So think Great Depression, minimal scale, or smaller scale, across the whole country. So all these traders who had debts due to them by the Myaamia community were now suffering on their own side of economics, and they wanted to call in these debts. So all of that pressure builds into this treaty, the 1838 Treaty of Forks to Wabash. It's in this treaty that removal is first mentioned as a possibility, and it's the first time Myaamia leaders accept the possibility of removal. It doesn't agree to removal, but it says we agree to consider the idea of it at some uncertain time in the future. And this is where there's a nice parallel with the Wyandots. We'll send some people out to look at the lands you want us to live on, and then we'll think about things after they come back. Classic delay. When you're a lawyer and you're not ready to mount a defense, you ask the court to adjourn, right? Let me come back in a month, Your Honor. I have something else I need to do. That's the strategy today. It's no different. Delay. You don't have the ability to stop, so delay. In this treaty, the little more collective land is relinquished, a slice of the Great Reserve. In return, there's another village reservation grant made, and there's individual patents. The interesting thing about this treaty is these patents don't have clear status. So usually in the treaty it says, this is fee simple land, or this is protected from sale by order of the president. This treaty actually doesn't make that clear. It's one of the historical questions I have from this period of time. I don't know which this was, but it's another long list of individual patents. The 1840 Forks of the Wabash Treaty is a treaty that finally agrees to removal. And the story I learned about this treaty growing up as a kid is that Pinšiwa was nearing 80 years old. His health was not well, and he wasn't as sharp as he once was mentally. And that Allen Hamilton, a trader in the area, basically woke him up in bed in the middle of the night and convinced him to sign this treaty. That's a story I grew up with. Stories I heard from other families are things as simple as Richardville sold us out. Look at all that money he got. You know, I have a great quote from a Godfrey family elder. He says, Richardville sold us out. He got all that money, and then he stops and he pauses and he says, I don't know where it all went though, because his daughters sure didn't have any. And you know, descending from one of his daughters, I can tell you that's the case. And I can tell you, any money he did have, I know exactly where it went. There's a huge list of debts that are called in right after he dies. Now, I don't accept any of those stories as completely true. They all hold kernels of truth, but there's a little bit more to the story there because we don't fully understand the relationship that existed between Allen Hamilton, Richardville, the other Myaamia leaders, and the other traders in the area. And we need to actually explore more about that to learn what was going on. Why? Because of that quote. That quote says, some white men told us we get to stay. Who are the most likely white men who are in daily interaction with our tribal leaders? The traders. So it's quite possible that Allen Hamilton, the Ewing brothers, Tipton, others were saying, just sign this treaty, the 1840 treaty, and you'll get to stay. You have to give up the Great Reserve, but you'll just divide up across these small lands and you'll never have to go, don't worry. Right? That could have been what they're told. We don't know. The chances of that existing in a letter between Tipton and Ewing and Hamilton is actually pretty good. So we need to go back through all of their letters, which they were prolific letter writers, and look for that. Look for the evidence. It's probably there. If that's what happened, it's probably there. And the last point I'll make is Richardville and Hamilton clearly designed this treaty together. But all Myaamia heads of family, all of them, agreed to it. So Richardville wrote the treaty up with Hamilton at his house. Then they held a council, and they all agreed to it. So this wasn't something Richardville did by himself to Myaamia people. What happened, what occurred there is something where everyone came to agreement about it. And I highly doubt their agreement was, we're going to get to stay and the rest of you are going to have to go. I highly doubt that's what they said. Now what actually occurred, the failures around that, I don't know, but everyone agreed to it. So there's some big questions there for me. It's out of that mess that this house sits. Right? And you can't say that to the National Historic Landmark status, right? well, this is one big mess. But really it is. This house is a sign of amazing success and incredible failure. It's both. Right? And actually, the failure for us is far more important than the success. Richardville's money, his status, all this stuff. No. This, for me, is a sign of a powerful attempt to resist something that utterly fails. It's a sign of failure, really. Now, it's an important place. It's an important place that Myaamia people come to and gather today. But it's a visual sign of this really crazy period of time that we have to begin to take more seriously, just how messed up it was. The tangled knot of influences and power, and our own people trying to figure out how to find a place within it. This is our house, right? It's a house that in some ways we made for ourselves, and in some ways a house that was made for us. It's kind of a little bit of both at the same time. So one of the questions I have when you look at it that way are these traitors, who I always as a youth thought just clearly evil, right? Men, parasites on the community. But then you begin to look at it more and you wonder, did they really believe what they were telling us, that we wouldn't have to go, that this was the means for our survival? Is there a kernel of truth to that? So are they friends or enemies, or are they both? Now, if you study political history from this period of time, there's a lot of interesting discussion about the term friend. The political allies in the Congress use this word friend all the time with each other, while they're complete and total enemies behind each other's backs, off the floor. The political discourse in this period of time isn't the same as it is today. Political influence in this particular period of time isn't the same as it was today. And laws and attitudes and beliefs regarding ethics in this period of time aren't what they are today. So as an example, in this period of time, you could be an elected representative in the House who makes decisions directly related to your business and doesn't have to hide that at all. That being an ethical politician had nothing to do with your business life. They could intermix freely. Right? Today, people will talk about that. It does happen, but it's not supposed to happen according to the laws and the system, right? In this period of time, it's not the case. And so people can be very different things in this particular period of time in terms of their political behaviors. And we have to keep that in mind. We can't cast back and think about politics today. Back then, it was very different. The other really interesting thing I've learned as I've read studies of the settlement of the state of Indiana, and again, it goes against completely what you'd think about history, is that as the city of Indiana developed, there was a powerful triumvirate linked together of land squatters, land speculators, and politicians. Now, these are groups that in some cases look like they might be enemies. In fact, if you look at the history of the whole Old Northwest, they look like enemies. Politicians in Washington, D.C. and Philadelphia didn't want land speculators taking advantage of the Old Northwest. They wanted it developed according to political aspirations so that the country could grow in irregular means. Land speculators wanted to take that land and get wealthy off of it. But sometimes land speculators became the politicians, and sometimes politicians became land speculators. Squatters then look like this group that definitely shouldn't be allied with the other two. They're moving in and they're taking land that either belongs to Indians or belongs, at least on paper, to this group. And they cause all kinds of problems for this group, squatters do, because they're either causing problems with the Indian populations or they're messing up this plan for orderly settlement. But what in fact occurs in the territories once the territorial governments form is that these folks, they vote. These folks, they want, because they can't vote. They're not land speculators and they're not politicians. They sit out over here and they see the way power works, the way influence works. That if you want to do something and you want to change the way something is occurring, you have to crack this. So how do you do that? I don't fully know the answer to that question. I think I say that numerous times. But I'm beginning to see a part of it. And this is just one slice of, this is Indian reservations in one county in Indiana. And when they say reservations, again, we can't think in today's use of the term, Most of these are either family or individual land plots. So this is where the Richardville House sits today. So that's a Richardville Reserve. And all of these numbers are associated with various families. So I think we have some Jeromes here, right? This is, I think this one right here is a Jerome Reserve. So they're all associated with either individual heads of families or whole family groups. And they're scattered throughout just this one county. If you look at all the counties, you got little reserves up and down the Wabash and its tributaries, all throughout our homelands. Here's a village reserve called Sikh's Village Reserve. And you can see Chapin's reservation there. Here's Beavers Reserve, right? This is just south of Columbia City, Indiana. So these are, this is a village reserve. This is a head of family reserve. These are ones that would be protected. They're not fee simple, but they're held by individual families. Here's Peru, Indiana. Again, look at all these reserves. Right, so what we need, looking at Brad now, we need a map of all of our homelands that shows these reserves over time. So we get a sense of when did they begin, how long did they last, because some of these are lost pretty quickly to debt. They get them, they hold on to them for 5 years, and if they're fee simple, a debtor can claim them and they can be taken. Right? So some of them disappear. Some of them are sold back through treaties. So we gotta know like how they came and went. And I'd like to see it kind of progress over time so we can kind of learn from that. But you can see just how much land was there. Right? So the 500,000 acres disappears in the 1840 treaty on paper. But there's tons of land. So this idea that there's plenty of land for us to live on if you just let us move there seems completely reasonable once you begin to look at it and take it for what it says. But as I said, the 1840 treaty is really about failure. If that was the message, sign this, but you'll get to stay, it obviously failed, because here we are today, right? Richardville dies the next year. Godfroy had died before that treaty was signed. And in the years that followed, from 1840 to 1846, you see numerous very skillful attempts to delay removal on the part of Tupia, Francis LaFontaine. But he appears not to have had the same skill as Pinšiwa. I can say it no other way than that. He did his best, but he appears not to have had the same alliances and the same kinds of skills. These efforts at delay became increasingly less successful after Pinšiwa passed away in 1841. The system of alliances and checks and balances between the contractors and the politicians and tribal leaders that appeared to have been an attempt to stop removal collapsed, especially after 1844, when a contract for removal was purchased by Thomas Dowling, who was from Terre Haute, Indiana. So this investor, who now was financially interested in the removal process, he was going to profit by conducting the removal. This person, Dowling, was not a part of the network of traders. And so Miami leaders had no connections to him and no system of convincing this new person to delay removal any further. It's quite possible that Dowling may have only bought the removal contract as an investment, but in either case, his sole goal was to make money, not to build a system of relationships with Myaamia leaders. Sometime between January and February of 1846, Dowling sold this contract, and this is what makes most historians think he purchased it originally only as an investment, or he received the contract only as an investment. And he sold it in early 1846 to Robert Peebles, who is from Pittsburgh. Again, not a local trader, not a local investor, not a local politician, no political connections to Myaamia leaders. Someone, again, that there was no relationship with. And then in March of 1846, Peebles, who actually appears to have tried to conduct the removal and was frustrated in his efforts, Peebles sold the contract to a new group. Names, in this case, that Myaamia people were familiar with. In March of 1846, he sold the contract to George and William Ewing. They owned 1/3 share. Samuel Edsel, who owned 1/3 share, and Alexis Kilkillard, who owned 1/3 share. The Ewing brothers were well known to the Myamis and were a part of that system of alliances that were holding off removal. They were apparently working on the behalf of the Myamis and urging the Myamis to resist removal because it was in their financial interests. They were getting money due to debts from the trade every time there was a treaty payment. And so they were a part of this economic process and were both kind of using Myaamia people and being used by Myaamia people to hold off removal. Not a lot is known about Samuel Edsel's relationships with Myaamia people, but Alexis Kilkillard was well known, both in terms of the fur trade and in terms of a conductor of removals. He was feared to a certain degree, especially by Potawatomi people, as a hunter of individuals who escaped removals. He would go back and find them and bring them to Indian country afterwards. So once the contract passed into these people's hands, it would have seemed as though now the Myaamia leaders might have had the skills to manipulate the process to hold off removal. But one more key change occurred at this exact same moment. Also in March of 1846, a new agent was appointed for the Myamis by the federal government, and this was Joseph Sinclair. He was appointed superintendent of the removal. He had previously been appointed agent. And once Sinclair was put in charge of the removal, all ability of Myaamia leaders to check removal seems to have collapsed because Sinclair put forces in place where the Ewing brothers were no longer going to get economic advantage from the Myaamia staying in their homelands. He made it a point to officially stop the payment of treaty annuities until removal occurs. And so the Ewings and other traders were not going to gain financial advantage by keeping the Myamis in their homelands. And on top of it, the Ewings now had a financial investment in seeing the removal take place. So they would make money both by conducting the removal successfully, and then once the Myaamia arrived in the unorganized territory in what would become Kansas, once they arrived there, they would receive additional financial benefit as the annuity payment was made, and they would gain money from the debts that were owed to them. So now all of the financial and political factors that originally were stalling removal swung to the other side and were supporting removal. And in this particular context, Tupia did not have the skills or the connections to resist removal any further. In June of 1846, he took a last-ditch trip to Washington and attempted to gain exemption for the half of the tribal community that hadn't been exempted from removal yet. And Sinclair reported with great glee when Tupia returned that he had failed in his efforts. These are the people who are dealing with us on our forced removal. The delays continue, and in October, Sinclair brings in troops, U.S. government troops, and the forced removal begins. Now here's where things get really messy, on top of the mess that's already there. And it's full of all the pain that I started this discussion with. By this point, throughout those years, 1840 to 1846, the leaders of the entire community have gotten numerous groups exempted from removal. The numbers of families had grown to 5 through various forms. There were treaty exemptions, there were legal exemptions, and then they had, in one family's case, the state of Indiana lobbying on their behalf to get a family exempted. And Tupia took families with him, 4 more families, to try and get them added to the exemption list, and they were not added. Now, let me be clear about this. They had an exempted list. They did not have a non-exempted list. This gets back to that great question about population. They didn't know how big the Miami community was. The only way they knew Miami community was who came in and signed for an annuity. Right? That's the only way they knew. So as they began forced removal, they only knew who didn't go. They didn't know who was supposed to go. What we don't know is how they figured that out. We know that Sinclair called in Tupia and said, you've got to bring the non-exempted people in because there's going to be a forced removal. And if you don't do it, I'm sending the troops out to your villages. We don't know what happened after that. We don't know if Tupia somehow convinced people who were non-exempted to remove, or if the troops in fact went to people's villages. We do know that the traders, all of those guys, Ewing, Tipton, they were lobbying furiously with the US government to pull the troops out. That those traders, those people who had been in many ways taking advantage of us for years, were trying to get the troops pulled out of this scenario. And you can only imagine if the troops left, we'd have a few more cards to play and might have been able to stop things like the Potawatomis had. But they were unsuccessful. And so the forced removal begins in October and ends in November in Kansas Landing, in what becomes the state of Kansas. Tupia goes with members of his own family. And upon arrival at Sugar Creek, he stays for a little while. A lot of people are sick. And he waits for his own family to get better. And then they begin a journey back with 5 heads of families. And the stated goal is to get those 5 heads of families exempted. That would have been, so 323 went on removal. The 5 heads of families, the estimate is around 100 people. And so they may have been able to, if they'd been successful, they would have gotten another 100 people able to return home on paper. Gene, in his book, describes that perhaps as many as 100 did just that they turned around and walked back to Indiana, which is just what the Potawatomis did. In the Trail of Death, they got out to Kansas, and they turned around and they walked right back home. As soon as the federal agents were gone, they just turned around and walked home. So it's quite possible that quite a few Myaamia people did do that. We don't know. We can imagine and we can feel the very real pain of that moment. Tupia only makes it as far as Lafayette, Indiana, and he dies. His son was sick. In the letters you can see he's talking about his son being very, very ill. His son recovers, and he probably caught what it was that his son had, and he gets sick on the trip back and then dies. And so the last person who is really a part of this, heading up this plan of resistance to removal, passes away. And with the loss of those people goes the loss of the knowledge. And I can't imagine that the traders out there were sort of disseminating what happened. They probably kept that to themselves. We then, of course, experience our second forced removal from Kansas after it becomes a state to northeastern Oklahoma. The movement between those groups never ceases. Right away, people march back to Indiana. People come from Indiana to Kansas. The great example is the Drake family, right? With Jane Pigeon walking from Indiana to Kansas and showing up out there. There's numerous cases like that we don't have recorded stories for. The families constantly moved. As people lost resources in Indiana and struggled to survive, they then moved to Kansas. People who stayed behind in Kansas, as life became difficult there, moved to Oklahoma. So people constantly moved around in this period of time. But the pain of removal had to be felt. All the people around us in northeastern Oklahoma are a constant reminder of that, right? The people who were here who are always in this area, the Osage and the Quapaw, they don't, in terms of numbers of tribes, they don't form the majority. All around us are removed peoples, the Cherokee, our elder brothers, the Shawnee, our younger siblings, the Peoria, the Ottawa, the Wyandot. All these groups, we have long historical relationships with. Those relationships continue today, but they're a part of an interwoven history of removal. I can only guess that their stories are as complicated as ours. I kind of think of myself as I'm learning about the War of 1812 and Tecumseh's desires to have all Indian tribes in alliance with each other. And then I look at Ottawa County and I'm like, I wonder if he imagined this. I doubt he did, but it's a certain kind of alliance. All the tribes work together to meet goals that tribes can't achieve by themselves. And then sometimes they kind of have issues with each other when there's issues that do concern them. And so there's this kind of friendship and shared resources and shared space, and then there's little elements of competition. That's the way things have always been between these people, between us and our relatives. And so what does failure do to a community? This is some of the questions I'm going to close up with. That if there was this intentional effort to plan to resist removal, equal parts planning and also just the way things develop, and then that plan completely and utterly fails, what do people do with that failure? It's a question, again, I don't have an answer to. And you can imagine the pain, the feelings of resentment that things didn't work out. But yet, the community had to go on. And so these are the faces of some of the leaders who had to carry that forward. Out of that failure, they had to find a way to survive. And they did. So when they began this plan, if there was one, I don't think they imagined this room today. I don't think they imagined this room in 2009. All plans, even when successful, have unintended consequences. And all failures, most failures, no matter how horrific, can have positive unintended consequences. And one of the unintended consequences of the failure of removal is that the sovereignty of the Myaamia tribe survived. This is important, again, that we look at the comparisons. The Pokagans stayed. They got to stay on their dearly loved homelands. But over time, because of what had changed in terms of their land base and their population, the US federal government stopped recognizing them as a sovereign entity. And they had to fight to get that back. They were successful, but they had a long, hard fight to get that recognition back. The Eastern Cherokees, they survived in their homelands. They got to stay. But they had a really hard struggle in the South, in a racist place that followed the one-drop rule and based your democratic rights based on your physical appearance to survive. So through that failure, a different opportunity was created. And the sovereignty of the Myaamia tribe remains intact today because of that. Because in this part of the country, there was space and time to adjust. Right? In this part of the country, there were numerous other tribes all struggling to do the same thing, who could learn and share with each other and find a way forward. For the Cherokees in North Carolina, there were no allies. They were surrounded. For the Pokagans in Michigan, there were no allies. They were surrounded. And for the Myamis who were exempted and stayed in Indiana, it was the same thing. There was no political rights for them, no sovereignty, no national entity to maintain themselves around. And so there's some serious differences that occur based on those things. Just like anything in life, nothing is wholly good or wholly evil. There's the reality of life and what you do with it. You do the best you can with what you have. But the unintended consequences, I think, are something that we don't oftentimes look at when we look at the bad things that happened. We should never forget those things, and we should continue to talk about them. But we also should reference the unintended consequences of those things. I don't think when Richardville had this house built, came out of land from the 1818 treaty, monies for houses out of the 1826 treaty, and then some of his own monies was built in 1827. When he had this house built, I don't think he foresaw massive failure in his future. I don't think he foresaw National Historic Landmark status for his building. I don't think any of those things were in his consciousness. But perhaps he saw this in the future anyway. Right? Myaamia people coming together at that place to gather and talk and share as they had for 10, 20 years while he lived there. Perhaps he saw that. And that Myaamia people can still come back to this place today is in part due to the unintended consequences of his failure. And so we come back to Pinšiwa, where Julie started us off, and talking about the stories that exist about him, the feelings and attitudes around him. And I think about the legacy of failure of this resistance to removal. And to be frank, leaders who head up things that massively fail like this, they deserve a little bit of that. He failed. He and others like him who organized this effort to resist removal, they failed. And they deserve to be known for that. The negative feelings around that are legitimate. But it's not the whole story. And I hope I've given you a sense of that there's a lot more depth to this than just simply him selling Miami people out. There's a lot more to understand about this failure. Because the third path that they created here, this path didn't fail. The resistance to removal failed, but the tribe's use of legal tools to defend their existence, because military tools were no longer an option, has succeeded. If you look at people on the payrolls of tribes, lawyers are some of the top people, because they're used to defend the sovereignty of the nation in courts of law, to exert our sovereignty over our homelands here in Oklahoma and our historic homelands in other places, to protect the remains of our ancestors throughout our historic homelands. All of that is done through the legal realm, which is a kind of resistance. After 1812, we couldn't pick up a gun anymore. That wasn't an option. So instead, they picked up a different set of tools. And those tools, which a lot of tribes have sort of developed together, Indian law is one large body of law that applies to most tribes, those tools continue to be used by our nation today to defend ourselves, to exert ourselves, to protect ourselves, to help us survive and move towards thriving. And so in many ways, there's success in this story too. It's not to deny at all the pain of removal, the reality of that, but that there are some serious successes around the development of this strategy, and it's a part of who we are today. So Mission Myaamia for listening to me ramble on here at the end, and love to have questions, or if people have their own stories about this particular event they want to share, would love to hear them. Questions? Stories? Comments?
Comment, George.
Yeah.
First of all, I want to say missionary, I think this was a wonderful presentation and something that we need to always continue to do, and that's be our own historical detectives, like you said. You know, you say that, and I really like your point of using this term failure, because it was a failure. And they should be remembered for that. But to fail, you must try. And they were trying something very large.
Yeah.
And unintended consequences is very important. That sovereignty. Without a failure, without the trying, this may never happen. Maybe one of those tribes that totally lost everything. And so we say thank you to this failure in some sense. And I say thank you for bringing it back to our community's attention, because we don't remember history, we remember history, because so many things are lost. History is about what we forgot more than it is what we remember. And so Mission Myaamia.
You know, and there is a reference in Tupia's letter after they get out to Kansas where he says there was enough land for us to stay there. So we could have stayed. We had the land set aside for us, but we beg your forgiveness at this point, because we finally bent to your will, and did not want to be. We felt that we looked at it in a bad light, because obviously, again, survival depended upon having at least a somewhat of a formal, amiable relationship with the government. But I think that's an important point that he does talk about. That land was there. There was more than enough land for our people to stay, and we fully intended, and we believed we could. And he does reference. He doesn't say who those people were. We told him that, but he does seem to reference those traders at that point.
Yep. Yeah, and the key is, I think that's one place where the documents probably exist. The stacks of letters from all these traders to each other and to Miami leaders is huge. I've only been through a small part of them, and so there's tons more evidence out there for all Myaamia historical detectives to go find. And I think this is one place where we have a good chance of finding some evidence to support it, on top of what's already in the removal letters. Yeah.
The trader Ewing related to the Ewings of Ohio?
I think they are, but I honestly don't know for sure.
The only reference was that a kid named Tecumseh Sherman was adopted by the Unions in Ohio.
Hmm.
He eventually became William Tecumseh Sherman, the Union Civil War general.
Mhm.
The Catholic priest changed his name because he thought Tecumseh was what would be a savage name, or it wasn't a Christian name, so he tacked William on the front of it. That's how he got the name William.
Yeah, and it's quite possible. And there's also a Ewing who gets elected to the House of Representatives. And so I don't know for sure. When I saw that, I want to know more about Ewing family genealogy to know, because for Americans as well, family was alliance. And so the question is, how are they utilizing their alliances to manipulate things to their benefit? That can tell us more about Myaamia people's situation. Yeah, Paul?
I would comment that the state of Indiana politically has always been really oppressive to tribes. That's true then, it's true now. It's something that we're all negotiating with at some level or at some time or another with the state. To me, it's evidenced by the fact that, at least in my mind, the removal policy as a period tool of the United States government to purify certain lands was pretty much obsolete by 1846, wasn't it? Wasn't it pretty well known that the Myaamia tribes of that era would be moved again as Kansas wanted to become a state?
Yeah, I don't actually know for sure how much that was already in the discussion, but it could have been, yeah.
I think we were already in that manifest destiny period with we were going to go coast to coast. That's my impression. Just a comment.
Yeah. Yeah, but they knew it was just another temporary holding ground until they moved him again.
It was expedient for the politicians in Indiana to clear the land.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep. Yeah, and again, you come back to that nexus between squatters, land speculators, and politicians. And by that point, the 500,000 acres was the last unsettled piece of Indiana. So it was the last piece of the pie to fight over. So while it wasn't that much land in the grand scheme of the whole state, it was really good farmland. It was at the center of the state, and it was the last piece to fight over, which, the fighting, becomes even stronger. And squatters did, as soon as the treaty was signed, squatters started moving onto the reserve. That occurred in Kansas as well. Those stories are really well documented in Kansas. And I think I'd only say comparing Indiana to Oklahoma is really a night and day comparison. In Oklahoma, tribes give. Tribes participate in the funding of education, right? Through all the casinos involve compacts where money goes to the state of Oklahoma for education. That gives tribes an incredible level of influence in the state of Oklahoma. Now maybe they can't tell the state what to do, but the state has to tread a little bit lightly when dealing with tribes because there's this economic exchange going on. In Indiana, it does not exist, and they don't want it to exist. Well, I encourage everyone to take moments like this when we come together. Right now it's around annual meeting and stomp dance where I see lots of Myaamia people coming together to talk about family stories of history, whether it's going all the way back to removal or pre-removal to history that's maybe a little bit more recent. That by talking about them, then, like Joshua said, we don't forget those stories, that they're maintained. Make sure that the stories that you have about your family are shared with the young people in your family. And one of the things that I'll say as someone who's interviewed a lot of family members as well as non-family members who are Miami elders is that these stories don't have to be clearly Miami Indian stories. They're stories about people, about the community, about how people live. Those are really, really valuable stories because those help us understand stuff like this. Because that's what's missing from stories like this, is the nuts and bolts of the way the community was living. Stories just about how are people putting food on the table. Those are the really, really powerful stories that tell us very important things about this period of time. And that's no less true of the 1930s, the 1940s, the 1950s. That the stories of just how people lived are incredibly valuable to us. So make sure, at the least, that you're sharing them within your family. And at the most, if you want to work with Megan here in the archive or others who work in history, that you share them there too. Whatever you all feel comfortable with. So I'd love to see conversations like this continue. Oh, Nishinewe.